This hearing will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Before I deliver my opening remarks, I wanted to note that today the committee is meeting both in person and virtually. And I want to announce a couple of reminders to the members about the conduct of this hearing. First, members and staff who are attending in person may choose to be masked. It is not a requirement. However, any individual with symptoms, a positive test, or exposure any individual with symptoms of positive test or exposure to someone with COVID-19 should wear a mask while present. Members who are attending virtually should keep their video feed on as long as they're present in the hearing, and members are responsible for their own microphones. Please also keep your microphones muted unless you are speaking. And finally, if members have documents they wish to submit for the record, please email them to the committee clerk, whose email address has been circulated. And thank you all for joining our hearing on the findings of the latest working group reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I also want to thank our expert witnesses for being with us today. The reality of the latest IPCC reports cannot be ignored. Global emissions must peak within the next 3 years to ensure we stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming in the next century. But we also must move swiftly to adapt to our climate future alongside our efforts to cut carbon emissions. I attended the 26th UN Conference on Parties, or the COP26 last November in Glasgow, with Speaker Pelosi and a number of my colleagues. Throughout COP26, the need to keep within 1.5 degrees of warming while making global efforts to support community adaptation was a recurring theme. The Science, Space, and Technology Committee has been working to pass legislation needed to curb the worst climate impacts. Even with current efforts to curb carbon emissions, climate change has already permanently altered the lives of most Americans. Whether it is flooding, drought, or extreme weather, the impacts of climate change are being felt by all of our constituents. There are many climate impacts that are already baked in and will occur regardless of how quickly we cut emissions. This means we must move forward with robust climate adaptation approaches alongside emissions mitigation. Many adaptive solutions are already available and have been outlined in the IPCC latest report. Many of our federal science agencies have conducted research to collect the data needed to plan for the adaptation. This research includes data on climate, how crop yields will shift in time, and how rising sea levels will impact communities. Utilizing this data for ambitious and impactful climate action is necessary. However, it is also imperative that in finding solutions, the voices of communities most at risk are not left out of this discussion. Local community leaders see much of the firsthand impacts of climate change, and indigenous communities hold generational knowledge that focuses on adaptation and resiliency. Indigenous and local knowledge is beginning to be recognized in broader adaptation methods, although more work is needed. We must ensure that this knowledge is not only considered in climate adaptation efforts at all levels of government, but is done equitably. As I said at COP26, we deal with science and facts on the Science Committee. And we know it's time for us to take action on climate backed up by good science policy. The science climate change has been clear for many years now. It is up to us in Congress to begin implementing the innovative technologies and policies that are already available to us to address climate change. This effort needs to include robust bipartisan legislation to support our federal science agencies as they work to address the climate crisis. The next few years will be critical in determining the U.S. response to climate change. We already have much of the expertise and knowledge of researchers and community members to guide us toward an adaptive and equitable future. I'm pleased to have such an esteemed panel of witnesses to discuss these issues at today's hearing. Translating recommendations from IPCC reports is necessary for the U.S. climate science enterprise to take actionable steps to combat climate crisis. Today's hearing will play an important role in providing further insight on how Congress can support these efforts. And with that, I yield back. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member Lucas for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Johnson. We're here to discuss another angle of climate change in a continuation of previous hearings we've had on this subject. My hope is that today we can focus on the most significant action our committee can take to address this challenge, supporting breakthrough energy technologies. In the past 15 years, the United States has decreased its total emissions by 21%, which puts us on track to meet the Obama administration's goal of reducing emissions by 26% by 2025. That's significant progress and an achievement we should be proud of. How did we get there? Through breakthrough technologies. In 1990, more than half of our electricity was generated by coal. Today, that's down to 20%. In that same time period, wind, solar, and natural gas energy ballooned. Together, they now account for 50% of our electricity generation. We've also made coal cleaner since the 90s, reducing emissions in the process. We couldn't have made this clean energy progress without new discoveries. We needed the new drill bit technologies developed at our national labs, for instance, to power the natural gas revolution. All this is to say that we've proven that new technologies are critical in emissions reductions. Investing in technological development through R&D is what I see as the carrot approach to addressing climate change. The flip side of this is the stick approach. That's what we've seen in Europe, with mandates and strict limits on certain kinds of energy. The result of the stick approach is a cautionary tale. Prices have gone up, emission reductions haven't matched ours, and now, with Russia's war against Ukraine, Europe is facing energy shortages. That's why it's so important for us to take an all-of-the-above approach to clean energy development. Now more than ever, we can appreciate the value of American energy independence. We can't afford to shut off valuable energy sources in a misguided attempt to reduce emissions. Instead, we need to focus on the science and technologies of tomorrow. I'm very proud of the work we did on the Energy Act of 2020 to do just that. It invested in fundamental research and development in high-risk, high-reward, next-generation energy technologies. It also took a broad approach to clean energy that included a wide range of renewable resources, as well as essential technologies like advanced nuclear, energy storage, carbon capture, and research into cleaner, more efficient use of fossil fuels. It supports innovation with an approach that keeps American energy competitive and prices low for consumers and business. And it did all of that without a single mandate, goal, or regulation related to emissions. The natural follow-on for the Energy Act is the DOE Science for the Future Act, which is part of a dozen bipartisan bills that the Science Committee passed in an effort to make the U.S. more competitive and to put our technological development into overdrive. The DOE Science for the Future Act will significantly increase our funding for basic research at the Department of Energy, focusing on transformative technology. As we begin conferencing this legislation, which will be shoehorned into the larger Competes Act, my priority will be to focus the final package on the smart bipartisan legislation we crafted together and to reduce the amount of superficial policies tacked on at the last minute. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the global implications of our fight to address climate change. This is, after all, a global problem. When we take unrealistic approaches to addressing climate change, what we do is empower our adversaries. Punitive measures that make fossil fuel production too expensive or simply prohibited gives Russia a corner on the market for natural gas. That money then funds Putin's war against free people in Ukraine. The cherry on top is that reducing our own production of natural gas actually hurts our emission goals because Russian natural gas has higher emissions over its lifetime. So cutting back on our domestic production might pay lip service to climate change goals, but in reality it does more harm than good. Another way we are empowering our adversaries is through the proposals in the Competes Act to send money to the UN Climate Fund. This sets up a pipeline, the wrong kind. It's a pipeline of U.S. taxpayer dollars to communist leadership in China. The Chinese Communist Party is a dishonest partner in the effort to cut emissions. Despite their pledges to the Paris Agreement, China's emissions have continued to grow. Even worse, it was found that the Chinese significantly underreported its emissions in the lead up to the agreement taking effect, making it hard to trust their current reports. If we implement reckless mandates to cut emissions, we'll drive up prices for American businesses and make it more difficult for us to compete with China on the global stage. We simply cannot afford that. So today, I'm hopeful that we can focus on solutions that will keep American energy affordable and accessible while also helping us to reduce emissions. Mr. Harrell, I'd like to thank you for attending and for joining us in person. I'm interested in hearing your perspective on market-friendly climate change efforts. With that, Madam Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lucas. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. After I introduce the witnesses, I will hand the gavel off to our Research and Technology Chairwoman, Ms. Stevens. First, Ms. Mo Barrett. Co Barrett is a vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. She is one of the first women elected to serve as vice chair. In this role, she provides broad leadership on the scientific and technical aspects of IPCC assessments and management and strategic issues. She also serves as a senior advisor for climate at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Within NOAA, she is responsible for providing strategic advice and direction. This enables the agency to align, integrate, and extend its capabilities to best provide the climate services needed to address the climate challenge. Next, Mr. Jeremy Harrell. Mr. Harrell is the Chief Strategy Officer at ClearPath. This research and advocacy organization focuses on policies to accelerate breakthrough innovations. These innovations reduce emissions in the energy and industrial sectors. As CSO, he leads the development, management, and execution of the organization's strategic plan. Before joining ClearPath, Mr. Harrell advised congressional leaders across multiple roles in the House and Senate. He advised on energy, environmental, natural resources, tax, and transportation policy for a decade. Our third witness today is Dr. Dominique David-Chavez. Dr. David-Chavez is an assistant professor of Indigenous Natural Resource Stewardship, working with Colorado State University's Department of Forest and Rangeland Stewardship. She additionally works with the Native Nations Institute at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy at the University of Arizona. Dr. David-Chavez draws from her experiences to lead research at the Indigenous Land and Data Stewards Interdisciplinary Lab. Dr. David-Chavez focuses on research and governance in environmental policy and decision-making, community-based climate research and resilience in the Caribbean islands and the Southwest. She supports pathways for decolonizing through Indigenous regeneration and research and teaching in natural resource sciences. Our third witness this morning is Miami-Dade County Mayor Daniella Levine Cava. Mayor Levine Cava was elected as Miami-Dade County's first female mayor in November 2020, following a 40-year career as a social worker, lawyer, and advocate for South Florida families. Mayor Levine Cava was elected to the County Commission for the first time in 2014 and served 6 years before being elected as mayor. She has empowered small businesses, increased community policies, policing in underserved areas, and improved transit options and housing affordability. She has also protected the environment and addressed climate change. She oversees more than 28,000 employees, serves nearly 3 million residents, and manages a $9 billion annual budget. As our witnesses should know, you will have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing. When you have all completed your spoken testimony, we will begin with questions. Each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. We will now start with Ms. Barrett.
Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm here today on behalf of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, for which I serve as Vice Chair. I concurrently hold the role of Senior Advisor for Climate at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. While these are separate roles, they do have commonalities in that NOAA's climate research contributes to the scientific basis for IPCC reports, and in turn, NOAA uses IPCC information as a basis from which we provide climate services to the nation. In fact, the recent IPCC reports affirm the importance of the work NOAA does every day and the urgency with which we are working to expand our delivery of climate services so that we can build a climate-ready nation. The IPCC, which is the world's foremost authority on climate science, recently released 3 reports. The first report, The Physical Science Basis, provided the scientific foundation about past, present, and future changes to the Earth's climate system. The second report, on Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability, provided an updated assessment of observed and projected risks from climate change, our vulnerabilities to it, and options to build resilience and the capacity to adapt. Finally, the Mitigation Report, released most recently, provided an updated assessment of methods for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and removing them from the atmosphere. Today, I'd like to highlight some of the key findings from this suite of reports. The IPCC found that recent changes in the climate system are widespread, rapid, and intensifying, and some changes are unprecedented. More specifically, the IPCC found the Earth has already warmed about 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times, with every decade bringing more record-breaking temperature. Further, it's indisputable that human activities are causing climate change. Human influence is making climate extreme events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe. For example, hot extremes have become more frequent and intense since the 1950s, and some would have been extremely unlikely without human influence on the climate system. This has meaningful implications for us in North America, where high temperatures and extreme events have cost American lives and disrupted economic activities. While climate change has already adversely affected billions of people around the world, the impacts and risks are not distributed equally. Some populations are more vulnerable than others. For instance, some climate impacts are magnified in cities, where heat waves can combine with urban heat island effect and air pollution to make the effects of climate change worse. Furthermore, climate change can exacerbate other challenges such as poverty and food insecurity, which often impact the most marginalized communities. These findings are concerning, but the report also offers glimmers of hope because there is increasing evidence of progress. We've seen that adaptation efforts are effective for reducing risks, and they can protect people and ecosystems from the worst impacts of climate change. At the same time, there are options available now in all sectors that can more than halve greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. For example, an increasing range of policies and innovative technologies have enhanced energy efficiency, reduced rates of deforestation, and accelerated the deployment of renewable energy, which has resulted in avoided and reduced emissions. So we already have many of the tools we need to address climate change. We just need to deploy them rapidly and across all walks of life. Everyone has a role to play. Global and national leadership is required to transform and decarbonize society, but cities and communities, businesses, Indigenous peoples, citizens groups, and public-private entities are playing a growing role in the global effort to address climate change. Inclusive and meaningful participation can build support for the transformational changes that are urgently needed to forestall the worst impacts. There's no doubt that climate change is a global challenge, but the potential solutions exist at all scales, from international commitments to actions in our local communities. Each of the IPCC reports reinforces the refrain that every fraction of a degree of warming matters, so every action to prevent warming can make a difference. The climate we and future generations experience depends on our actions now. Thank you.
Next up, we will hear from Mr. Harrell.
Good morning, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the committee. My name is Jeremy Harrell, and I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at ClearPath. ClearPath advances policies that reduce emissions in the energy and industrial sectors. An important note, we're funded by philanthropy, not by industry. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Climate change is an urgent challenge that merits significant action across the public and private sectors. The recent IPCC report underscores that the world is not deploying existing clean energy technologies fast enough and is not investing enough into the technologies needed to achieve net zero. Fortunately, the United States is in a position to accelerate global emissions reductions while creating new jobs, increasing manufacturing competitiveness, and reasserting global leadership over Russia and China. The ongoing aggression by Russia underscores the need for the U.S. and our allies to be energy independent, and energy security and climate action do not have to be mutually exclusive. U.S. LNG can be up to 30% cleaner than Russian gas. American steel has the second lowest carbon intensity, while China, the world's largest steel exporter, is the third dirtiest. In sum, American manufactured products are over 40% more carbon efficient than the global average. Yet it's clear the world does not have the technologies it needs to realistically and affordably achieve net zero emissions. The IEA estimates that only 2 of 46 technologies needed are on track. The U.S. should mobilize to innovate, to develop, and to demonstrate those technologies here and sell them around the world. We have a record of success. Solar, wind, natural gas, and battery growth over the last decade have driven us forward, and all are cost-effective globally, in part due to investments made here in the United States. I'd like to underscore 4 key points today. First, innovation is essential to achieving global emissions reductions. The previous IPCC analysis conducted a decade ago found that extremely high levels of temperature rise could be possible by 2100. The most recent reports conclude those consequences are no longer likely, thanks to innovation in clean energy technologies. No doubt, more work must be done, and it's also clear that policies that make clean energy more affordable and abundant are how the United States can help accelerate global progress. This committee's recent work on the innovation agenda, including your landmark Bipartisan Energy Act of 2020, should be commended, and the members should double down on it. Second, the big demonstration programs authorized by the Energy Act and funded by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill are a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Nuclear, CCUS, direct air capture, energy storage, enhanced geothermal, and hydrogen are all among the technologies that the IPCC, the IEA, and others all forecast as essential to meeting climate goals. And they were all focuses of those recent bills. The DOE's efforts, like the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, the CCUS Technology Program, the Energy Storage Grand Challenge, and the hydrogen hubs can all accelerate technological innovation. This committee's oversight of those efforts over the next 18 months is paramount to ensuring these taxpayer dollars are spent wisely and are successful in commercializing new technologies to combat climate. Third, difficult to decarbonize sectors merit increased attention. For example, in 2020, emissions from industrial facilities accounted for 24% of all U.S. emissions. By 2030, industrial facilities are expected to be the top source of U.S. emissions, exceeding those from both power plants and vehicles. While the Energy Act included great policies like the Bipartisan Clean Industrial Technologies Act, a greater focus on subsectors like steel and cement remain significant opportunities. Fortunately, this committee has already taken action on steel via the Bipartisan Super Act, which is now part of the larger American Competes USICA conference negotiations. The steel sector is well positioned given that American steel is among the world's cleanest. And even if all those efforts are successful on the innovation side, nearly all projections rely on some degree of carbon dioxide removal to offset residual emissions. And it's highly likely carbon dioxide removal will be needed to bring total emissions to net negative. Congress should build off previous legislative wins and support innovation in key areas like steel, cement, chemicals, carbon removal, and low-carbon fuels. And last but certainly not least, the U.S. mission must be build cleaner faster, not duplicate and litigate. It is abundantly clear that clean energy is not deploying fast enough. The U.S. should rapidly build what's available today while demonstrating new technologies in the pipeline as soon as possible. It does not matter how much money the public or private sector invest in climate if it continues to take 10 years to permit an offshore wind farm, 5 years to certify a new advanced nuclear reactor design, or 6 years to issue a Class 6 permit necessary to store billions of metric tons of captured CO2. The U.S. will simply not meet its emission reduction targets under the status quo regulatory environment. Congress should set bold goals to build projects in less than 2 years by modernizing permitting, reducing frivolous legal challenges, and prioritizing approvals of low-emission projects. This can all be done without compromising environmental stewardship or the public's opportunity to be involved. This committee is uniquely positioned to drive new clean energy technology forward through investments in American ingenuity and research. And your success is essential to accelerating global emissions reductions while growing American competitiveness. Thank you for the opportunity, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Harrell. And Dr. David-Chavez, you are next.
Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and distinguished members of the committee, in our Indigenous language, Mabrika Hahumwaipiao, I welcome and greet you as extended relatives and give thanks for this opportunity to share in this important discussion. This is the original language of the Taino or Arawakan peoples in my maternal homeland of Boricuen, also known as the U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, a place where Indigenous peoples have observed and adapted to extreme climate events for centuries. Our Indigenous and local knowledge and value system, including the language I'm sharing with you, continue to serve as resources for enhancing climate resilience. In this testimony, I draw from my experiences as an Indigenous community member and as a scientist, carrying a decade of experience working on community-based climate and environmental research with Indigenous and rural communities, and as a co-author for the 5th National Climate Assessment currently underway. Scientists now understand with substantial evidence the potential of Indigenous and local knowledges for guiding us through this difficult time in our human history. Amidst the challenges and crises that we now face, we also face unique opportunities for systemic change and innovation in policy and research design. This hearing and body of evidence before us mark a transitional time of reconciliation, both in terms of reconciling historic legacies of oppression towards Black, African American, Indigenous, and other marginalized communities, and in terms of reconciling our relationships and responsibilities as human beings with the natural resources and lifeways that sustain us. This brings me to my key take-home message. Mobilizing Indigenous and local knowledge systems for climate resilience can only be achieved through reconciling historic systems of oppression to enable the leadership of community members who steward these knowledges. The IPCC Working Group 2 report determines with the highest statistical level of confidence disproportionate climate-related impacts and harms for Indigenous peoples' livelihoods and economies
as well as threats to knowledge transmission and cultural continuity and harmful impacts on health and well-being. Community members retaining ties to the land are our first scientists and monitors of change: farmers, fisherfolk, those who continue traditional harvesting practices and hold knowledge of seasonal cycles, including ecological and atmospheric indicators of change. These indigenous knowledge systems, place-based collective bodies of knowledge formed over generations of observation of Earth's physical processes, reflect high-level Earth system science, understandings, and blueprints for sustainable planning and development. Yet numerous barriers remain for inclusion of indigenous rights holders and local stakeholders in development and research. Analysis findings of 20 years of climate studies accessing indigenous knowledges reveal 80% of studies practice extractive methods in which indigenous community knowledge holders and decision makers held little to no authority regarding research questions asked, data gathered, or whether data is shared back to their communities. Likewise, the IPCC report notes with high confidence a lack of recognition of indigenous sovereignty and exclusion of indigenous peoples from decision-making institutions as structural barriers constraining adaptation. Our federal government and resources hold a critical role in supporting community-based climate research to enable climate resilience, adaptation, and mitigation. While policies supporting reconciliation and diverse knowledge exchange are in effect globally, the US remains without a national policy regarding indigenous rights and ethics in research. With support from you, our leadership, we can immediately channel resources for community-led efforts toward achieving near and long-term climate resilience goals. Key strategies include: number one, pathways for intergenerational knowledge transmission through funded community-engaged internships and workforce training connecting youth with community knowledge holders, scientists, and mentors. Number two, upholding indigenous data sovereignty through agency-wide policies such as the CARE principles for indigenous data governance, now being operationalized for environmental data repositories here in the US, scaling up and standardizing mechanisms for accountability to tribes and communities. Number three, promoting equitable partnerships through funded leadership roles for indigenous and local community knowledge holders and decision makers to guide research design, proposal review, and policy development. And number four, streamlining flexible federal funding sources for tribes and indigenous community organizations that unburden unique challenges through adaptive timelines, zero cost share, and equitable funding allocated to community partners. Number five, applying protocols for consultation and consent that align with indigenous and human rights frameworks set by indigenous governing bodies for all development and decision-making impacting indigenous peoples' territories and resources. These actions support our future generations who need all the tools and insights available to address the complex challenges before us. Let us ensure the time-tested wisdom of our ancestors is there to guide them, to allow for the innovation and problem-solving potential needed for the benefit of all who share these territories, for our shared lifeways and our shared futures. Hahom, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Dr. David-Chavez. And finally, we will hear from Mayor Levine Cava. You may begin.
Thank you very, very much. I'm Daniella Levine Cava, Mayor of Miami-Dade County, and I have the great privilege to represent a growing, vibrant, and diverse community of almost 3 million residents and 250,000 businesses, more than 20 million visitors annually to our beautiful beaches, thriving economy, and cultural offerings. I want to thank our entire Florida congressional delegation, Bill Posey, Michael Waltz, Dan Webster, Charlie Crist, and our own Carlos Jimenez and Maria Elvira Salazar. Carlos Jimenez, my predecessor, who also championed our environment, demonstrating the bipartisan imperative of climate change. In Miami-Dade, our environment is our economy. It's what attracts our visitors, it fuels our prosperity, and truthfully, we are the canary in the coal mine for climate change. But we also live in perilous proximity to rising seas and stronger storms with significant exposure to our heating climate. We know that we must transform our business as usual attitude in order to protect life on our planet and our coastal cities. Last year, extreme weather cost our world hundreds of billions of dollars, and this will dramatically grow, we know. It does not even include the additional socioeconomic effects of ecosystem degradation, disruption of our global food and water supplies, increases in vector-borne diseases, and mass displacement following floods and wildfires, something we're very attuned to in Miami-Dade, hurricanes. So in South Florida, we've already seen 10 inches of sea level rise over the last century. But unlike other types of flooding, long-term sea level rise does not recede. We're expecting between 21 and 54 inches of sea level rise in the next 50 years. So no longer can we afford to only rely on mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions, though we're taking bold actions there, but we must also focus on immediate adaptation to thrive in this new reality. The IPCC report is clear. We must take these steps now to transition away from our dependence on fossil fuels towards renewable energy, but we must also take into account how we build our future infrastructure. We must integrate equity into our adaptation plans to ensure that we can adapt as a community together and without leaving anyone behind. Here we are already exposed to the most assets at risk of any place on the planet, and the immediate effects have become very, very clear, and we need to seriously reimagine every aspect of our local government and respond decisively. Because we live at sea level, we must prepare for coastal property damage. Because our water supply comes from our underground aquifer, we must address saltwater intrusion. And because of the intersectional challenge of poverty, we are exposed to greater health risks. Our children, our elderly, and other vulnerable residents suffer more sickness when pollution leads to an increase in asthma and heart disease. Our poor and less protected suffer heat stroke if left without the protection of air conditioning. And many private insurers are already pulling out of our market, leaving residents to assume climate risk on their own. Last Earth Day, I announced our commitment along with 45 other governments to the international race to zero. We're on a unique path to net zero carbon emissions. We also are transitioning our public transit, our county vehicle fleet, advancing conservation and reparation efforts in our bay and across the Everglades. And this is all part of our response. We're building mobility systems to reduce carbon. We're expanding our green and blue spaces and more trees to populate our tree canopy. We recently released our landmark climate action strategy. We believe it's a model, and we ask the federal government to consider requiring all communities to produce such plans. We joined with ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, at COP26, and we stood together for those goals. And we have a regional climate change compact. It's a model with over 100 local governments, 6 million people, 15 million visitors, and our non-governmental and private partners all coming together, working on sea level rise projections every 5 years. I'm a founding member of the International Heat Alliance, and we appointed the first ever chief heat officer in the world, and it's now being replicated in cities around the globe. So we're accelerating adaptation. We're integrating sea level rise into our design guidelines and our growth master plans, but mitigation is no longer enough, and we must implement bold adaptation measures. We have a sea level rise strategy released in 2021 that prioritizes our septic to sewer transfers, protecting the health of our bay. We're expanding our purchase of environmentally endangered lands. And we cannot do this only at the local level. We must collaborate across our state and national boundaries, and we need more transparency, greater understanding, and real efforts to bridge divides across our diverse constituencies, all of which will need to be invested in our fight against climate change. So we call upon the federal government to provide crucial funding for research on the cutting edge. We need to scale up our efforts, and we will need federal support to do so. And we need the federal government to continue holding these sorts of high-level meetings to shed light on the vital issue, to coordinate our state, local, and federal responses. And we must do it equitably. So here, every dollar invested saves us $4 in disaster recovery later. Thank you very much to you for your leadership, and we look forward to working with you towards the solutions.
Great. Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to all of our witnesses. And at this point, we're going to begin our first round of questions, and the chair is going to recognize herself for 5 minutes. We have seen the IPCC reports before. We've seen the Paris Climate Accord. We've seen our chairwoman go off to COP26. We've heard an incredible articulation of the problem, and we can hone in on that. You know, what cost? You know, if we don't do anything, what's the result of that? What's at stake if we don't take immediate action? But more importantly, I think the question I want to ask to our witnesses is why? Why we haven't been taking action, or how we have been taking action in small ways. And I'd like to start with Ms. Barrett, because I was really struck by the articulation in your testimony. On page 3, you talked about levels of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, the root cause of human-induced climate change, current CO2 concentrations, the highest that they have been in 2 million years. You also went on to talk about the report confirming global warming at 1 degree Celsius has already adversely impacted billions of people around the world, especially in marginalized communities, something that we have heard from our panelists here. But then you go on in your testimony, you talk about resiliency and adaptability and some of the actions that we're taking. So, Ms. Cotto, could you talk to us about the how we are taking actions and the why we aren't maybe moving as fast as we could be?
Sure. Thank you for your question. I mean, I think many of us on this panel have already identified that this is a dire situation, but we are making progress. Emissions, the rate of emissions in the US is declining, not quickly enough and not across the board. Adaptation actions are beginning to have effect. But it's interesting to look at some of the research on what drives action. And to see that for many Americans, there is a recognition of the problem. There's even, you know, a recognition that in their own lives, they're experiencing extreme events. I think the research shows that about 1 in 3 Americans has experienced negative impacts from extremes. But, you know, we are in some sense buffered a little bit by our wealth, and I don't see the urgency of the issue really taking hold in all aspects of society. I also think, as the mayor mentioned in her testimony, that we need to be providing support at the local level where really people are on the front lines of feeling the effects of climate change. So this really is a all hands on deck problem that we have to marshal across, you know, every sector of society.
Yeah, and maybe we can hear from our mayor for a minute, because you absolutely are on the front lines, and certainly as we think about climate change and this, you know, rising call to humanity right now to address what stands before us, you're doing this on the local level, and you're seeing successes, starts and stops. What's working? What isn't? What do we need? What else do we need to know?
So I am hopeful that the market does also help us, not only because there are technological advances, certainly ways to reduce our carbon in vehicles and buildings, and we have very aggressive strategies to incentivize those things, but also because the private sector is building higher, pumping things that help us live with the rising seas, and more electric vehicles as we build more capacity, and so on. We just had the governor veto a bill that would have made it more expensive for people to install residential solar. So he did it in light of the high cost of living. So I think that there is progress being made as we're no longer debating whether there is climate change. You know, maybe not everybody agrees on the causes, but we all agree on what we see. And I'll say that when you have an extreme weather event like we had a couple of years ago with Hurricane Irma and the streets were flooded, that gives people religion. And that was the year that the city of Miami passed a major bond referendum to pay.
Well, we are very excited about electric vehicles in Michigan, particularly our original equipment manufacturers, the big three that are proliferating that technology and certainly trying to achieve the goals of carbon neutrality. And Mr. Harrell, I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to give you a quick note that I appreciated the practical reason and the work that you're doing, the practical reason that you brought to your testimony. And I think the theme here is yes, we have these reports. Yes, we've identified that we have challenges, but there is so much hope and opportunity. There's things happening at the startup level. There's things happening in the classroom. There's things happening in our Indigenous communities at the research level, and on. So with that nice kickoff to this incredible hearing that we're having right now, and with that, I'd like to pass it over to our ranking member, Mr. Lucas, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and continuing with that perspective of hope. And Mr. Harrell, as you pointed out, natural gas, solar, wind, and energy efficiency technologies have led to a 40% reduction in power sector emissions in the United States in the last 15 years, while GDP has grown by more than 60%. If we continue this trend towards cleaner energy and a stronger economy, what's the single most effective action we in government can take?
Thank you, Mr. Lucas, for the question, and really thank you for your bipartisan leadership at this committee and the immense successes that they've had over recent years. You underscore a key point that we've seen emissions go down as GDP growth has gone up, and that's, I think, an important lesson over the last decade, that is a recipe to success. And it's a big part because we've made clean tech more affordable and more abundant. And so we need to double down on the innovation agenda to make more clean tech more abundant.
Continuing with you, Mr. Harrell, for years, this side of the aisle has stressed the need for the United States to be energy independent. And for a long time, it was felt that many of us were concerned, literally, that it was falling on deaf ears. But Russian aggression in Ukraine and the resulting desire to shift away from their energy supply has created a vacuum for natural gas in Europe and made U.S. energy independence attractive to everyone. My question to you is, what benefits, including consumer cost, global environmental effects, and security, does a U.S. energy independence and resulting LNG exports have not only for U.S. citizens, but for the entire world?
Yeah, absolutely. Energy security and climate action do not have to be mutually exclusive. They can go hand in hand. We're seeing firsthand in Europe in particular that complicated our reaction to the Russian aggression. And so needing to be able to increase domestic LNG production, which I underscored is 30% cleaner than Russian gas, is a significant part of filling that gap. And we're seeing the Europeans interested in a wide suite of U.S. technologies, including nuclear as well. I think it's an important area to increase energy security across the globe.
And continuing that vein, how can just a little bit of innovation in a related field like hydrogen completely shift the conversation around future energy imports and supply gaps?
Yeah, we're extremely excited about the hydrogen opportunity in this country. The U.S. has both a cost and a security advantage relative to Russian, Middle Eastern, and Australian competitors in hydrogen. And so investments like the $8 billion hydrogen hub program at DOE that I think this committee really should focus on the oversight of the implementation of that could drive down the cost. In addition to policies like the 45Q tax credit really gives us an advantage to be a global supplier of hydrogen in the future. And hydrogen's a kind of Swiss Army knife clean energy tool.
Mr. Harrell, I think I can speak for both Chairwoman Johnson and myself when I say we greatly appreciate your kind words about the Energy Act of 2020 and what it has meant for energy policy and the conversation around climate change in this country. The Energy Act was a great achievement, and now we're working on the next step, a comprehensive authorization of basic research at DOE and the Office of Science. As I'm sure you've seen, we're in the process of reconciling differences with the Senate through the conference process, and given your familiarity with DOE and the national labs, how important it is that the inclusion of a detailed Office of Science authorization to the next generation of clean energy?
It's extremely important. The innovation agenda goes from basic research and catalyzing technologies to the applied work that we're now seeing DOE launch and try to demonstrate these new technologies. And so I think it makes a lot of sense and really commend the committee's leadership on that bill so that we can continue to push forward the innovation agenda in the long term, because this is a long-term problem and we need to drive forward.
So it does complement the Energy Act.
It does, absolutely.
And surprisingly, Madam Chair, with that, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Well, how about that? And with that, we will hear from the Congresswoman from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Chair Stevens. Thanks to Chair Johnson and Ranking Member Lucas as well for holding this important hearing. And especially thank you to all the witnesses. We understand now that climate change is caused by human activity and that it exacerbates extreme weather events and natural disasters, sea level rise, as we heard today, glacier retreat, and more. In the Pacific Northwest, we feel these effects acutely. Last summer, Northwest Oregon experienced a deadly 1 in 1,000 year extreme heat event. Mayor Cava, needless to say, my ears perked up when I heard you talk about and I saw in your testimony, the chief heat officer. We've also had exceptionally damaging fire seasons we've suffered through the last couple of years. And just earlier this year, Warrenton, a coastal town in Northwest Oregon, declared a state of emergency because of extreme flooding. The IPCC's sixth assessment is made clear, and as does the title of this hearing, we have no time to stall on climate action. We must implement sweeping adaptation measures and also decarbonize as rapidly as possible. So, Ms. Barrett, thank you for your leadership at NOAA and as Vice Chair of the IPCC. Scientists predict that there's a 37% chance of an earthquake along the Cascadia subduction zone in the next 50 years. This is likely to cause a tsunami. The NOAA Science Board recently released a report outlining the urgent need to upgrade our tsunami warning system. Strengthening that warning system is especially urgent because of the changing climate, which can increase the intensity of tsunami events. So, Ms. Barrett, I'm working with the committee on a reauthorization to the Tsunami Warning Education and Research Act to address these important recommendations. So, what ongoing steps is NOAA taking under its existing authorization to improve the effectiveness of our tsunami warning systems?
Congresswoman Bonamici, thank you so much for that question, and also for the support that you've shown to NOAA for many important climate-related initiatives, be it ocean acidification, coastal protection, et cetera. I am not fully aware of our tsunami activities. It's not a part of my core portfolio, although I was a part of the research arm of NOAA when we deployed for the first time our DART buoys that were, provide an essential component of our early warning systems for tsunamis. But I'd be happy to bring back your question to those in my organization who can fully answer that.
Thank you so much, Ms. Barrett, and I know that Dr. Spinrad will be very familiar with the issue, being an Oregonian himself. Also, Ms. Barrett, offshore wind has the potential to create thousands of high-quality jobs and decarbonize our electricity sector. Yesterday, BOEM, the Bureau of Offshore Energy Management, identified 2 prospective areas off the coast of southern Oregon where it hopes to eventually hold offshore wind lease auctions. So, Ms. Barrett, what is NOAA's engagement in the BOEM offshore wind permitting process? And how has interagency collaboration changed in light of the interagency memorandum of understanding signed earlier this year that seeks to further the ambitious offshore wind energy goals of advancing wind energy responsibly, but also while protecting biodiversity and promoting cooperative ocean use?
Thank you for that question. I mean, I know, in working with Dr. Spinrad, the blue economy is one of his 3 priorities for NOAA, along with climate and injecting equity concerns across all of our mission space. Offshore wind is a key component of the way that we approach the blue economy. And I know that we have aspects of our fishery service who are engaged in the permitting and have been working very closely with interagency partners across the board on the coordination for what we hope to be about 30 gigatons of energy production from offshore wind. I'd be happy to bring back your question to the experts who really dig into these issues in NOAA and get back to you on that.
Terrific. I would appreciate that. It is a new concept in Oregon, but we are one of the leaders in the study of wave energy, and I'm very proud of the work that PacWest is doing off the Oregon coast. Unlike wind, which can stop blowing, and sun that doesn't always shine, the waves and the currents are always in motion. So we're very much watching the potential for marine energy. And also thank you, Ms. Barrett, for mentioning the blue economy and the importance of the blue economy. I invite all of my colleagues on this committee, as well as in Congress, to, if they are not already co-sponsors, to co-sponsor my bipartisan Blue Carbon for Our Planet Act, which will do a lot to restore coastal communities, while also with the seagrasses and mangrove and kelp and other plants that are included in the restoration effort will act as a tremendous carbon sink. So invite everyone to sign on to the Blue Carbon for Our Planet bill. And I'm out of time and yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we will pass it over to Mr. Posey for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stevens, and thank the panelists for appearing here today. I've got the same 2 questions for each of you, and you can answer them in the order you were introduced, if you don't mind. A recent poll by Mooring Consultants found that 90% of Americans think the U.S. should manufacture renewable energy domestically, and 70% think we should not be dependent on the Chinese controlled factories in Southeast Asia for solar imports. The COVID pandemic, supply chain disruptions, and invasion of Ukraine have reminded us of the importance of energy independence. Today, most of the solar production is, of course, dependent on China. Question 1 is, what is being done to build rather than undermine our domestic solar capacity? And 2, what can Congress do to protect American manufacturers from China, which uses slave labor to make their solar products?
Thank you, Congressman. I'll start with the answer. I will say from an IPCC perspective, scaling up production of renewables wherever we can do that is incredibly important and a key piece of the solution, because decarbonizing society is kind of at the core of all solutions to solve the problem. With regard to the barriers that may be standing in our way to do that and our reliance on China and other places, I'm not really very well positioned to answer that question, but I do have access to many experts, both in the IPCC world and across the interagency, who could get back to you with a specific answer to your questions.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Congressman Posey, for the question, and thank you for your strong support of critical minerals legislation and the Super Act, for example, that kind of gets right at this issue. It's a really important issue as we look at the innovation agenda moving forward. I think solar is unfortunately a warning sign of the U.S. policy had a significant role in driving down the cost of it, and then we ultimately lost solar supply chains to China. And so as we look across technologies and investing in innovation, we need to be looking at how we build out U.S. supply chains, how do we source domestic resources needed to construct those technologies here at home in an environmentally sound way. And really look at supporting and increasing U.S. American competitiveness. So I think that needs to be layered kind of across the innovation policies that this committee takes up. Particularly on the solar side, one area that I'm particularly interested in is perovskite solar. It's a technology that's getting a kind of breakthrough at NREL, the national lab in Colorado. It's thin film solar. I think it's the next generation of solar that can be basically printed in rolls. I think it's an opportunity to invest in the manufacturing here, and I don't think we're going to bring back silicon PV from China, unfortunately, but I think we can bolster domestic supply chains on next generation solar technologies.
I appreciate the question and just the complexity that it raises in regard to how we're going to navigate the innovation and technology development we need to transition to renewable energy. One thing I think this is helpful to bring in mind is to consider how we're weighing out the benefits and risks, and that we are considering human rights and moral and ethical obligations to other human beings and to our land and natural resources. So much of our metrics for weighing out benefits or successful measures and the risks of different measures are operating on such small timescales that really don't reflect the timescales that it takes to remediate ecological degradation. So I think as we look at different renewable options, considering the costs in manufacturing, the costs in disposal, and what those long-term costs we might be giving to the future generations and not considering now will be very important in making the decisions about the concerns that you raise. Thank you for the question.
Congressman, thank you so much. And let me say thank you to you for the Florida Solar Center initiative that you champion. And we would like to be a part of that. So I understand, through university partnerships, maybe we could expand that to South Florida. Locally, we certainly have done everything to facilitate permitting of all of these renewables. That's part of what I did as a commissioner before I came on as mayor. We also have a blue-green tech initiative, and we have even floating solar. The legislature here just passed a law making it easier to move forward with floating solar, which we've already pioneered and I have championed here at the local level.
I thank the witnesses, and my time has expired, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you to the Congressman from Florida. And with that, we will turn it over to the Congressman from the Commonwealth of Virginia, Mr. Beyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, very much. And thanks so much for holding this hearing. The Joint Economic Committee just released a report on Earth Day last week called The Cost of Inaction on Climate Change. We pointed out that economists agree that a 2-degree warming would lower GDP by 0.5% a year. When you figure that we went most of the last decade with 1.5%, 1%, 2% growth, that's a lot. And at 4 degrees would cut GDP by 2% annually. Even modest warming is going to shrink the economy by hundreds of billions of dollars, with higher temperatures raising costs at an increasing rate. So, Madam Chair, I ask that this report be submitted for the record.
So moved.
And then many scientists are worried that when the second and third IPCC report came out, no one was paying attention. We're all obsessed with the Ukraine war in Russia. So I just want to say, please don't be worried. We are paying attention. We recognize and value these reports. They inform our work. And even more so, they give us that sense of urgency with which Congress needs to act. Ms. Barrett, you're vice chair of the IPCC. Can you tell us why these reports are so valuable to the policymakers?
Thank you for that question, Congressman, and thank you also for your kind words about the importance of our reports. The hundreds of scientists from around the world would very much like to hear your appreciation for the work that they dedicate for about 4 years of their lives to assess all that we know on the state of the climate. I think the IPCC reports are unique and important in a number of ways. First, it is truly a global effort to assess all that we know about climate change. And by global, I mean we have scientists from all around the world, from developing countries as well as developed countries, who come together to assess the information. But the kind of unique thing about IPCC is the way that then governments are involved in this process. So all of our member governments, 195 plus, review the reports, and we go into a very intense process to agree on the summary word for word. We did all of that virtually during COVID, which had its pluses and minuses. On the plus side, it enabled us to have much more developing country representation in the approval process. And I think that really helped with making sure that the results were really important from the perspective of all who need to take action. But that consensus, that handshake between scientists and governments, I think gives the information that the IPCC puts out a certain level of confidence. And I will say that the government involvement is particularly key in helping scientists to frame their results, frame their findings in ways that are accessible and useful for those who need to use the information.
Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Harrell, one of the things that the IPCC report said is that even the full shift, even if we get to zero fossil fuel use, we still have to deal with the billions and billions of tons of carbon dioxide we've put into the atmosphere in the last couple of 100 years. Can you speak to the role that negative emission technologies, for example, in Build Back Better, we sponsored an amendment for direct air capture. Talk about what negative emission technologies can contribute to this.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman Barrett, and thank you for your leadership on carbon removal and hydrogen policies and fusion technology as well. Carbon removal technologies are going to be essential. We're going to need gigaton scales of it over, and not only to help reach net zero by mid-century, but likely to go net negative on emissions for a long period of time. There's a lot of exciting developments in the direct air capture space, so technological solutions that will do this. I think the committee could spend additional time on innovation and kind of hybrid carbon removal technology solutions as well that leverage the best of some of our natural solutions as well as technological solutions. But it's a technology, it's a suite of things that we need to invest in now because we know that it's going to be necessary over the next 50 to 70 years to stabilize the climate.
And Mr. Harrell, thank you so much for mentioning fusion. The more we talk about it, the more we can begin to pull people in an optimistic direction. Mayor Cava?
Thank you. I just wanted to add that we have natural carbon sequestration, for example, in the Everglades. The restoration of our Everglades is a bipartisan federal, state, local commitment, and it is having a huge impact, and it's at risk of the opposite. So we need to continue that investment of natural as well.
And thank you for bringing up that there are many, many nature-based solutions, and we need to pursue all of them. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Well, thank you. And with that, we're going to pass it over to Congressman Babin for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member Lucas. Appreciate you witnesses as well. Mr. Harrell, as you mentioned in your testimony, the federal permitting process can take years for a project to be approved and cost millions of dollars along the way. I've seen firsthand the impact that burdensome and excessive regulations have had on companies in my district in southeast Texas, basically 9 counties from Houston over to Louisiana. And they have had the impact they've had on companies that are helping supply the world with clean energy. We can only reduce CO2 emissions as fast as we are able to permit the projects to do so. And yet, just last week, the Council on Environmental Quality rolled back opportunities to streamline this permitting process. If our own companies, which are making reliable and clean energy, cannot even get the permits necessary to move forward in this process, how can we expect them to meet the growing demands? And so, Mr. Harrell, what opportunities do you see to reform this permitting regime to enable this to be improved?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman Babin, and thank you for your leadership on CCUS issues and policies here at this committee. Some really exciting stuff happening in your district in particular in that space. And so you're exactly right on the permitting side. The fact we need to reduce emissions now, and that means deploying technologies now. And the current status quo regulatory environment simply isn't consistent with the scale that we need to drive technologies forward, and we see it firsthand. You underscore this issue at CEQ and their reversal. It's why I firmly believe Congress needs to act on significant permitting reform to give certainty to the private sector as we look to develop. We can't go through these ebbs of flows of where there's a new administrative rule by one administration, we have a political turnover, and then we've now completely reversed it. A lot of these projects take years and millions of dollars to invest in to get to construction. That uncertainty dries up private sector investment, and so Congress should act on aggressive permitting reform and really drive forward, and I think that can be done while still being good stewards of the environment and including public comments.
Thank you very much. And further, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, no power sector technology has been responsible for more emission reductions than natural gas over the past 10 years. We've also moved to become a top exporter of liquefied natural gas, LNG, allowing more countries to utilize cleaner fuels. Yet time and time again, this administration continues to criticize this clean energy, halt pipelines and pipeline construction, and increase regulations on our own domestic producers. How does restricting fossil fuel development like clean LNG, which is so important to my district and in my home state, How will this impact global emission reduction goals?
Yeah, it's a great question, Congressman, and we saw this firsthand in Europe as a result of the Russia-Ukraine crisis.
Absolutely.
Europe relies on Russian gas, which is significantly dirtier than U.S. Gas, and the drying up of that export because of the conflict didn't reduce the demand on natural gas, right? It meant that they had to look in other places, and so increasing production here, increasing the export capability in this country as well, not only is good for energy security across the globe and for our economy, but it's also good for emissions as well, because U.S. liquefied natural gas is 30% cleaner than, for example, our Russian competitors.
Thank you. I really appreciate you being here, Mr. Harrell, and with that, I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
Well, thank you so much. And now we will hear from the Congresswoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Wild, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I'd like to address the issue that often is paramount in my district, which is flooding. It's a particular problem in Pennsylvania's 7th district, which is the greater Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania, where residents experience persistent and severe flooding along the Delaware River due to constant increased precipitation from climate change. The IPCC recognizes that historic rainfall is 3 to 10 times more likely as a result of climate change. And believe me, people in my district would absolutely testify to that anecdotally. And honestly, we lose work days as people are not able to get to work and employers have to shut down. There's a lot of property damage that results from it. And it's just really a terrible concern. So Ms. Barrett, I'd like to ask you, as we consider near-term climate adaptation, how is adaptation to inland flooding included in these methods?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it is really clear, if you just look across the US in recent years, that flooding is an increasing concern. And I guess maybe with my NOAA hat on, I can say that NOAA is kind of focusing on getting the best science and information possible into the hands of decision makers to help communities prepare and adapt to all of the impacts of climate change. But with respect to inland flooding, that includes better soil moisture observations, precipitation forecasts, improved flood inundation mapping, for example. You are probably aware that NOAA received about $500 million from the IIJA infrastructure bill specifically for flood and inundation mapping and forecasting. So I'd be happy to follow up specifically with you and your office on this effort. But I also would like to just add, we recognize the need to update our precipitation estimates. These are the estimates that are used by federal, state, and local agencies to develop regulations related to infrastructure design and planning. And we provide these for the entire country using the latest data and using a methodology that considers how these precipitation patterns are changing. The current methodology that we use assumes a stationary climate. And this method is in use everywhere and it's peer-reviewed, but we're now working on the next generation that will incorporate non-stationary climate. And we hope to get that out as soon as we can.
Thanks so much. And I didn't mention in my question before, one of the things that has further exacerbated this in my district is that we have had a proliferation, as many districts have, of warehouses with flat roofs. And so the stormwater runoff has really, really contributed to this problem tremendously. But that's not just a climate issue, it's also a planning and infrastructure issue, obviously. I just want to, I have almost 2 minutes left, and I wanted to bring up the issue of international cooperation. And I don't need to go through this, what's happened with the Paris Agreement. I'm happy that we have rejoined it. But translating the high-level science at the international level to everyday individuals is not an easy task. By the way, I'm also, in addition to being a member of the Science Committee, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Ms. Barrett, in your testimony, you mentioned that the report found that 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in global hotspots. That's almost half the globe. Can you please explain to this committee and the public why we should care so much about the effects of climate change on populations outside the United States?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And it is true that, billions of people are affected. The real answer here is this is a global problem that requires a global solution. And, the systems are all interconnected, and it's impossible for us to leave anyone behind as we craft a solution, a true and lasting solution to this problem. So while many of those billions who are most vulnerable live outside of the bounds of the US, we also have people within our own country who are very vulnerable. Often these are underserved communities, people of color. And we certainly have a responsibility to them that can also set an example for the way that we interact with the rest of the world.
Thank you so much. With that, my time is up and I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And with that, we will hear from Congressman Garcia for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all of our guests for today's testimony. In our mutual goals of reducing emissions, and especially from the Science Committee, I think it's important that we remain goal-oriented. I think we need to remain anchored to data. And so, Ms. Barrett, in that regard, and especially from an international perspective, I just had a few questions. One, in terms of the macro global look, what is the current percentage of CO2 within our current Earth's atmosphere? You mentioned in your report that it's the highest concentration in over 2 million years. What is that concentration?
I'll have to get back to you with the exact numbers on that. If you'd like the current, or are you talking about in our most recent report?
Yeah, I think it's important for us to have the perspective over time so we can see rate of change and rate of change as well. And then in terms of contributors to this challenge, which nations are sort of the top 3 or 4 contributors to CO2 emissions?
So if you look kind of at cumulative emissions, the U.S. is at the top of that list.
No, I mean today, actual burn rate of emissions, real time.
Yeah, so for the last decade, at the top of that list has been China.
How do they compare relative to the United States in terms of either CO2 emissions by ton or, I guess by ton is probably the right metric, right?
Yeah, I don't have those figures just with me right now, and I'd be happy to get it to you. But I can say that if you look at the trends over the recent decades, the U.S. Trend has been to decrease the rate of growth over these decades, while China is increasing.
Yeah, and that's the problem. And I actually have those figures for your reference. China represents about 30% of CO2 emissions on the planet, which is about 10 billion tons, which is about twice as much as the United States at about 5 billion tons. 5 billion with a B. And so in your written testimony, you have a statement that says we have to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius warming trend. If it goes above that, that's effectively a breaking point. And you said that in order to achieve that, the global greenhouse gas emissions need to peak before 2025 at the latest and be reduced in aggregate by 43% from 2019 to 2030. And if what you said is true, which is that China is not actually decreasing its emissions, we have a bit of a math problem here. If they're emitting 10 billion tons a year and we're emitting 5 billion tons a year, that adds up to 15 billion tons, and a 43% reduction would yield about 8.55 billion tons, which means that between the two countries, if we kept this 2-to-1 ratio, we would need to be roughly about 3 billion tons of emissions, which is more than our fair share if China is not reducing. So my question goes to how do we fix this math problem? From an international perspective, we have now allocated $8 billion of U.S. taxpayer money to this UN climate fund. You say words like equity and inclusion, but my understanding is that the money that's going to China through this UN climate fund vehicle is actually going to the Xinjiang province, where we're currently witnessing one of the most brutal genocides in the history of our planet since World War II, with the Uyghur genocide, where we're investing in China or giving money, American taxpayer dollars, to China to build effectively clean energy. That's the intent. I don't think we have any reporting mechanisms. So my question to you, from an international perspective, in your position as the vice chair of IPCC, with the responsibilities that you have, besides compelling Americans on how to reduce our emissions, how do we do that for China? And how do we avoid sending precious American taxpayer dollars to the Chinese Communist government and other bad actors in an effort to get to lower emissions and ensure that they're actually spending it on the right projects?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a good one. But I'll just note, you know, as a science body, the IPCC doesn't make individual recommendations for any country, including for the U.S. But what we do is to highlight that this is a global challenge, as you were pointing out, and it requires a global solution. The level of effort that's required to turn the tide on emissions reductions is heavy. It's big, and all countries will need to play their part. I hope I haven't indicated in my testimony, either oral or written, that this is a U.S. problem to solve. This is a global problem for us to tackle together.
I understand that. I'm out of time, but I'm just very frustrated that we have no solutions to compel China besides throwing more taxpayer money at it. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Great, thank you. And with that, we'll hear from the Congresswoman from North Carolina for 5 minutes of questioning. Congresswoman Ross.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us. Time and again, scientists have warned that we're at risk of doing irreversible damage to our planet. The IPCC's sixth assessment report does not deviate from this finding, in that we must act now to prevent extreme weather events, protect vital ecosystems, and reduce emissions to make the world cleaner, safer, and more livable. If we do nothing to stop the accelerating pace of climate change, our most vulnerable communities, as we've heard, including racial and ethnic minority groups, will shoulder the burdens of these effects. This underscores the urgency with which we must act. In doing so, we should rely on studies like the IPCC's assessment in the discussion today to understand what we can tangibly and realistically do in the short and long term to mitigate harms. And I want to also say, as somebody who's practiced renewable energy law for more than a decade, I share my colleagues' concerns that we're not developing alternatives to carbon-producing energy more quickly. And I'm all for figuring out the best way to solve these problems, both behaviorally and technologically. I represent North Carolina's Research Triangle, and I'm proud to have an excellent research institutions in my district, including NC State, working on this issue. They're constantly innovating to produce technology that combats climate crisis. My biggest question really is a joint question for Ms. Barrett and for our mayor, because I love working with my local elected officials. North Carolina, just like Pennsylvania's Congressman Wild discussed, is no stranger to extreme weather events. These events are becoming more and more frequent with climate change. In 2018, the rapid and unexpected intensification of Hurricane Florence caused over $1 billion in damage. And we know that Florida is even more victim to these hurricanes. I would love to hear from both of you, and in particular, maybe leading with our mayor, about the importance of cooperation at different levels of government, whether there are specific actions that can improve partnerships between local government and the federal government. So let's start with our mayor, and then maybe Ms. Barrett, you can tell us how you can help our local governments.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman, for the question and the observation. And for sure, we benefit from extraordinary levels of cooperation here in South Florida. We have this climate compact, which encompasses all of the counties in the region, and we've been working together for over a decade and been noted as a best practice. So we have annual conferences, we do research projects together, and we collaboratively set targets around climate issues. So really, it's a best practice think tank. I also want to mention our emergency management system in Florida is very robust because of the history with hurricanes, no doubt, and strong state support from our Department of Emergency Management, and then each county with their own. I, for example, am incident commander for any hurricanes. When the building fell in Surfside, I was incident commander. And it's really critical that we have that support all the way up to the federal government, setting best practices. And we're going to be expanding to an all hazards approach more robustly. And I recommend that as well.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Congresswoman. And I have some roots in North Carolina, so nice to be able to speak with you. Maybe I'll answer your question from a NOAA perspective. And I can tell you that NOAA utilizes its boots on the ground activities across the country to kind of provide trusted and targeted climate information to its users at all levels. And importantly, to learn with them and to bring back improvements into the services and the science that we produce. And we are very much focused on strengthening these existing efforts, including through a network that we have across the country, the RISA network, a Regional Integrated Sciences Assessment Program. And also in this year, we are expanding our existing climate kind of community services through a new Climate Smart Communities initiative that will work in tandem with some of our other programs, including the Sea Grant program in all coastal states, to scale up and accelerate the pace of community scale resilience building, and to do it equitably and inclusively across the nation. So there are 30,000 communities across this country, all of whom need information to help them plan. So we will start the process to recruit, train, and equip these folks to fund a cohort of adaptation practitioners who can work in communities and help to build the resilience plan that we heard the mayor speak about in her opening testimony. Also in our FY23 budget, we're really looking to build the way, to pave the way for a role in building.
We're going to have to move on to the next question. As much as we know, as much as Ms. Barrett and the Congresswoman from North Carolina are phenomenal, we have other members here waiting, and so if you don't mind, we'll just pass it over to 5 minutes of questioning for Ms. Bice right now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Many people know Oklahoma as a top oil and gas producer in the U.S. And while there is a large and proud presence of that industry in my home state, Oklahoma is also home to the third largest wind production in America, accompanied by solar, hydropower, and biomass. With a diverse energy portfolio, Oklahoma has a strong energy hub for the country and has high standards for the impact this energy production has made on the environment. But as the country moves towards a larger use of renewable energy, one thing that I have concerns about is workforce. It's important to consider the impact of these new technologies in that space. Mr. Harrell, it's estimated by 2050, roughly 60 to 80% of all global energy will need to come from renewables. At the same time, energy storage jobs are projected to increase over 800%, which is a key piece of deploying renewable energy. Could we be facing a workforce problem that could slow deployment even further after we develop the technology? And what is the solution to avoiding that?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman Bice, for your question. I think it's a really important issue to take a look at as we look at the American supply chain, the workforce needed for deploying new energy technologies as a whole. Absolutely, we need to be looking in areas. I think one area where I'm particularly excited that has a lot of promise in your state is in the geothermal space. A lot of crossover between the oil and gas industry and geothermal from the drilling techniques. I think geothermal can play a huge role in meeting our zero emission, firm, flexible energy needs. And so utilizing the engineers who've worked in that industry and leverage them in new areas, I think are going to be important. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities across other industries as well as we look at staffing new nuclear deployments and employing engineers. These new nuclear designs that we plan to deploy in this country have nuclear islands, right? So one portion of it is purely nuclear engineering type things, but the using the heat from it to generate steam and produce electricity is the same for any type of power plant. And so there's some really interesting translations for workforce going over there. But as we look at it, I think it's important that we invest in the workforce in our communities and ensure that Americans are benefiting from robust supply chains that are going to support new clean energy deployment.
I think it's a great point. As we invest in technology, we also have to be thinking about investing in the workforce, because without those workforce employees, then we're not going to be able to deploy. Mr. Harrell, in 2021, we had the largest single increase in the build out of global pipelines for carbon capture and storage in the U.S. Was home to nearly half of the new project announcements. While this is exciting news, Americans are constantly hearing false narratives from the other side of the aisle regarding how pipelines aren't part of a responsible climate approach. I know ClearPath has done some research on the topic. Could you talk about how carbon capture and storage facilities benefit more than just oil and gas?
Yeah, absolutely. Carbon capture is an essential technology needed for global emissions reductions. That's something that the IPCC report, the IEA, and others have all agreed on, and it's particularly important in the industrial sector, whether it's reducing emissions from steel production, from gas processing, from cement production. It's one of those kind of unique technologies that have a wide array of roles, and so for us to really scale that, we're going to need CO2 pipeline infrastructure. We're going to need to be able to move the anthropogenic CO2 that we're capturing from these facilities to storage sites across the country. And then, Mr. Beyer earlier was talking about carbon removal. Same situation. We're going to take CO2 out of the air. We're going to need to move that CO2 and store it underground. So the ability to streamline permitting, to give certainty to industry as we build that infrastructure is really going to be essential to meeting our climate goals and deploying that clean energy infrastructure.
And I think just as a follow-up to that, some folks back home that I've spoken to that are in the pipeline business have indicated that permitting has become a real problem for them. A permit that may have taken 6 months to obtain a couple of years ago is now taking 12 to 18 months. And at that point, you're not sure of the feasibility of the project, right? So I think that it's wise for us to think about, if we're going to invest in these types of technologies, we need to be able to not only launch those products, but get it fully implemented through the permitting process. Last question. Can you talk a little bit about hydrogen? That seems to be a big topic of conversation across the country, and certainly hydrogen hubs are something that we're hearing quite a bit about.
Yeah, absolutely. Hydrogen is a really important tool across sectors of the economy. Hydrogen can be used to reduce emissions in the power sector, in the industrial sector, as a low carbon fuel that can combusts to get the heat needed to make products like steel, and potentially as a tool in transportation as well, most likely with heavy duty or maritime. And so there's a huge opportunity here in the U.S. We have, as I mentioned in my testimony, a global advantage in the production of it. And so I think we should be focusing a lot on the hydrogen hubs that the Department of Energy are about to deploy here. I know your state is partnering with Arkansas and others there. I think it's a really exciting opportunity.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. I was just trying to be fair. And with that, we're turning to Chairman Bowman for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Lucas, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I want to call attention to the fact that the latest IPCC report, I believe for the first time, explicitly calls out settler colonialism and capitalism as major causes of climate vulnerability. For example, it says that present development challenges causing high vulnerability are influenced by historical and ongoing patterns of inequity, such as colonialism, especially for many indigenous peoples and local communities. It says that colonialism and capitalism have dispossessed indigenous peoples and disrupted culturally significant multi-species relationships. This question is for Dr. David-Chavez. Thank you so much for your testimony. How is settler colonialism and capitalism linked to the current climate emergency that we are all faced with and dealing with?
Thank you so much. I appreciate this question and this historical context. Here, we're in a young colonial nation. We all bear the legacy of colonization and the agendas driven by colonization, how they've impacted our relationship as land stewards. And indigenous peoples, over 500 nations, sovereign nations here in the US, and many more state recognized Indigenous communities, especially many in North Carolina, and also non-federally recognized Indigenous communities in the US territories, for example, have been stewarding and managing the land with a lot of the same solutions and strategies that we're now finally looking to today, 5 centuries later, and have been doing so for generations, centuries, and millennia for many communities. And colonization has really dispossessed Indigenous peoples of that land and severed the ability to uphold those customary responsibilities that many of our governing bodies, many of our community members take to be their inherent right and responsibility to take care of those lands. And so really that's been one of the biggest impacts, but also the education system pushing us away from these valuable bodies of knowledge, including scientific ways of knowing, that we're now working to make sure we can reconnect to and that we can share those with all the newcomers who share these lands with us now. There are some really, really great examples, though, that I want to highlight of how people are addressing those colonial legacies. We don't have national policy, as I mentioned, as many other colonial nations do, around truth and reconciliation, and that creates a big barrier for us in having to educate our colleagues and our peers here in this nation. But we do have some great Indigenous scientists and leaders that are leading the way and showing how we can work through those colonial legacies and challenges to continue to apply some of those responsibilities, some of those land management techniques that have helped us for so long today. And I wanted to highlight from North Carolina also Ryan Lumby's work as a leading hydrologist that's looking at using the best scientific technology available and Indigenous ways of knowing to assess how we can address flood risk. Dr. Carletta Chief in the Southwest, who's leading the Indigenous Resilience Networks. And we have a lot of other examples of—
I want to try to squeeze in another question. I'm so sorry. Thank you so much for that. The IPCC report says that global investment in climate action is up to 6 times lower than what is needed by 2030. It also notes that public and private finance flows for fossil fuels are still greater than those for adaptation and mitigation. We are all very familiar with how the fossil fuel industry has lied to the public over decades and continues to lobby against climate action and for more fossil fuel growth, even though their existing infrastructure is enough to blow the world past safe levels of warming. My question for the panel: why aren't we mobilizing our society on a wartime footing to deploy renewable energy and create millions of good union jobs starting in marginalized communities? Why are we risking the future of humanity to protect the fossil fuel industry? We can start with Barrett, please.
Well, thank you for your question. I mean, I think an answer that I'd like to share is that we actually are setting forth on the path to address this issue. It is not a question of us, standing still. We have shown that if we invest now, we can avoid damages, especially in adaptation, sooner than later. And it's really important to do that. It's true that if you look at the commitments that countries have made to developing countries, we have not met those commitments.
Thank you. I know I'm out of time. I yield back.
With that, we're going to hear from Mr. Obernolte for 5 minutes a question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Ms. Barrett, I'd like to have a discussion about some of the working group reports. Frankly, I found them very discouraging reading. They paint a very bleak picture of where we're at and where we're going. And I'll tell you, the thing that keeps me up at night is thinking about feasibility, because it's clear that from the reports that the situation is dire. It's clear from the reports that the longer we wait to take action, the more catastrophic the problem will become. In fact, just reading from the Working Group 3 report here, it says all global modeled pathways that limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with no or limited overshoot, and those that limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius involve rapid and deep, and in most cases, immediate greenhouse gas emissions reductions in all sectors. The working group report spends just a little bit of space at the end talking about feasibility. But I mean, here's what keeps me up at night is, worrying about whether or not, how feasible it is for us to even get here. I mean, we're the United States Congress, obviously. We only have control over one country, the United States of America, and our country accounts for something like 13% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at other developed countries, and not to pick on a country like India, but it's a developing country, and I'm only mentioning India because their population is so large and it makes the math easier. As those developing populations emerge from poverty, they're going to consume more energy as their lifestyle increases. And even if they were to consume energy with the efficiency of a developed country like Japan, which is probably the best of the developed world in terms of per capita consumption, that would still increase global greenhouse gas emissions by about 25%. So, I mean, this is where we're at, right? The United States the last few years has been decreasing our global greenhouse gas emissions. The worldwide greenhouse gas emissions are going up. Even if we completely eliminated our greenhouse gas emissions, that would continue to be the case. So, give me some hope here, Ms. Barrett. How feasible is a solution to this problem?
Well, Congressman, I think you have put your finger on a really big challenge, and that is that things are still going in the wrong direction. And as many developing countries look to further develop, the pressure on the climate system is only going to grow. That's why I think it's really important to look at some of the options that we have available in all sectors right now to start to make a difference, to set an example here in the US. And in some cases, these developing countries can leapfrog technologies and not necessarily have to go through all of the stages of development that are heavy in their fossil fuel use. But I think it also points to an interesting challenge, because we have at this hearing talked a lot about innovation, and it's true, there are so many possibilities with innovation. But we're in a race with the risks that we're facing as increasing warming faces this planet. So we've really got to take best advantage of the options we have available to us now while we also innovate.
Sure. I mean, I would agree, but unfortunately, even if a developing economy like India were to, as you suggest, skip over fossil fuels and go straight to the best of what we've accomplished in the developed world right now, it still wouldn't be enough. I mean, it would still, India's overall greenhouse gas emission would still increase 25% if they were at the level of Japan. So, I mean, is there any hope, do you think? Well, I mean, let me ask the question differently. What is your confidence level that we can stabilize worldwide greenhouse gas emissions, I mean, let alone start reducing them in this century?
I'm fairly confident that we can reduce them this century, and I think the IPCC reports would support that. It is a heavy lift. There's no getting around that. But I think it's also important to look beyond the kind of international level and to look at the opportunities that exist at every level of society. And one of the things that I think the IPCC report on mitigation did quite well was to also look at subnational actors like Mayor Levine, Cava, that even citizens groups are engaging in this topic. And I personally maintain optimism. I've been working in this field for 20 years because I think we have no other choice but to solve this problem.
Sure. Well, I would agree. I see I'm out of time, but I would agree with you that we have no choice, but I don't share your optimism. And unfortunately, the decisions that we make on mitigation have serious consequences economically for the same groups that we're trying to protect. Because by raising the cost of energy, we lower people's standard of living. By raising the cost of goods that are manufactured, we lower their standard of living. So it's this slippery slope that we're on. And that's why I was looking for a little bit of hope. You remain an optimist, I remain a pessimist, but it's a fascinating discussion. I thank you for the testimony. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Mr. Obernolte might not have been here for the first 5 minutes of questioning, but we did talk about optimism, hope, and frustration. So with that, we'll pass it over to the chairwoman from New Jersey for 5 minutes of questioning, Ms. Harrell.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all our panelists for being here today and our witnesses. While federal action is critical, local governments are on the front lines of the climate crisis in New Jersey, and the IPCC provides critical insights for policymakers at all levels of government. But local leaders of smaller cities and towns don't necessarily have the resources to integrate this and take this vital information and put it into their local planning. So Ms. Barrett, NOAA and other federal agencies have a wealth of information about climate and weather hazards, as well as many different programs housed in different offices that could help local communities make climate smart decisions to protect themselves from extreme weather. How can local leaders, especially in smaller towns with few resources, like a small town mayor in my New Jersey district, integrate information and tools from all the different agencies' websites, platforms, and data sources? Would a single stop planning tool that pools information and solutions from all agencies be better for communities than having to go to each agency's different climate platform?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think you are really putting your finger on something we hear again and again from local communities across the country. Because requests for climate information and support come into many federal agencies through their specific clientele. You can take, for example, farmers who may be interested in this season's possible threats. They may come directly to NOAA to ask for information on those hazards, or they may work through USDA, which is a primary source of support for them. And ideally, we would have an interwoven federal information system that connects all portals to the information folks are looking for. I will say, to this end, NOAA is utilizing some of our infrastructure funding to work with USGS and other federal agencies on what we're calling a climate resilience information system to bring together this information to do exactly what you are pointing as a need, so that we can build the information from across the federal government and make it more easily accessible to those who need it.
Well, thank you. I applaud your focus on that, because I know it would be something we would really find helpful in New Jersey. I'd also like to ask about, education, because educating the next generation of climate professionals is really a critical part of our preparedness. And there are several provisions in the America Competes Act which focus on the development of a climate-ready next generation workforce. So, Mayor or any of our witnesses, what kind of professional training is currently offered at state and local levels?
Thank you so very much, Congresswoman. And I would like to also say that totally agree with you that that's a critical concern. It was raised earlier. We are working very aggressively with our workforce board to totally revamp our job training. That would be through high school, and post-secondary as well, to address the new jobs, the new economy. So much so that we're looking at spending money on apprenticeship exactly to start people in jobs, try to make sure that we can match the talent pipeline with the existing new jobs, because we know for the industry, everybody's looking. They don't always find people with the requisite skills. And so we're aggressively partnering to make that happen.
Mayor, who are you looking to do that? Are you looking at your community colleges? Are you looking at your states? Like how are you even going back to high school? Like, how are you creating those programs? Where are you looking to fund apprenticeships, or where are you looking to put resources?
Well, the county actually put $5 million of the American Rescue Plan into a pipeline training at our community college, matched by the Knight Foundation, a locally headquartered national foundation. And other dollars were put into our other universities so that we could create a continuum. And to get back to the point about collaboration, my middle name is Collaboration. I do everything that way. And so not only do we have all the universities come together around a pipeline initiative, they actually have a place where they set an agenda and work together on this. We also have the cities within my county of 3 million. There are 34 cities, and we regularly convene all of them, provide technical assistance, shared resource information. We're looking together at grant applications around this whole field, because what benefits one city benefits the other, et cetera.
Well, thank you. Some great ideas to take back, and my time has expired. Thank you, and I yield back.
And who would have guessed that Miss Cheryl and my middle name are also collaboration? With that, we'll hear from Mr. Feenstra for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stevens and Ranking Member Lucas. And I want to thank all the experts in the panel for sharing their expertise and experience on these issues today. Mr. Harrell, thank you for being here in person. I really appreciate that. I got a question. There have been significant investments being made by the DOE, as well as incentives like 45Q tax credit that has spurred on a lot of private industry. In your mind, have those been successful in incentivizing the private sector to invest in these innovations?
Yeah, I think 45Q is the most robust tool, frankly, in the world to catalyze the deployment of CCUS, and we saw that firsthand last year. The largest influx of CCUS projects in the global pipeline, and over half of them are in the U.S., a good chunk of them in the Midwest, because some significant opportunities, particularly in the ethanol space in CCUS, so I think that's exciting. And I think it's important that the credit had some long-term certainty, right? It's the most recent reform that was enacted gives some certainty into the later 2020s, and so it's driving private sector investment into the sector.
Do you see anything else? I mean, we have 45Q. It's a great tax credit. I firmly agree with you. Is there anything else that we can do on the research side to further innovation like this? I mean, we're looking at it from the tax side now with 45Q, but is there anything else that we can think outside the box and say, hey, this might further private incentivization?
Yeah, it's a great question, Congressman. An idea that's out there that has strong bipartisan support is the Energy Sector Innovation Credit. And so it gets to a tax policy that really gets at the crux of catalyzing new innovative technologies. It's what we're seeing in 45Q. It's catalyzing the first wave of projects. So the Energy Sector Innovation Credit is most robust when a technology is nascent, so the first few projects, and then naturally wanes down as the technology becomes more commercially viable and is stronger or shown its commercial viability. And so a policy like that could help drive investments into new technologies, give confidence to investors to deploy these kind of first-of-the-kind type things, and then get out of the way once it's proved itself commercially viable.
Yeah, well, I thank you for that. I think that's very important. One of my colleagues, Congresswoman Bice, noted that energy storage jobs are projected to increase by over 800% over the next several years. I want to come at it from a different angle, because I've heard from Congresswoman Cheryl also talking about jobs and stuff, but how can NSF play a role in terms of student development and how we can use NSF in a way that's meaningful in this job creation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an important federal organization that can help bolster STEM education in this country, involving more folks to go into this industry and want to innovate, to find new ways to do storage that doesn't require these minerals that we have to be reliant on from China. And so using kind of the strong science institutions in this country to bolster a U.S. workforce, I think is really important.
Yep. And finally, sorry to keep picking on you. Yeah. I'm one of the largest ag industries in the country, my district is, and obviously there's a lot of concern about a lot of regulatory issues coming down the pipe. We've talked already about the NEPA. My farmers are really concerned about this. And I just want to know what your thoughts are. Is this something I should worry about, they should worry about? Is it detrimental? And I look at it from my ag industry that they're volunteers. And they do a great job of volunteering to do better for their soils and conservation and all these things. And I just wonder what your thoughts are when we further down the path to restore the NEPA in 2020, pre-2020.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think we should be looking for ways that the federal government can partner with ag producers to deploy technologies that do more sustainable ag practices, for example, things along those lines. If we're truly going to deal with emissions related to agricultural activities, we need to be innovative, we need to be nimble, we need to try new things and drive new technologies forward. I think that's an important piece of the puzzle.
And saying that, how do you do that with the family farm, right? Do we incentivize them? How do we create the carrot? Do you have any ideas on the carrot of how we do this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are incentives that could be utilized, especially, next Congress, we're going to be looking at a Farm Bill reauthorization. And so looking at some of the USDA programs that partner with family farmers that can help them pilot new techniques, things along those lines. Because those are the folks with low margins who really can't take that financial risk. And I think that is where the role of government makes sense, right? And helping partner and drive forward solutions.
Well, thank you for your comments, and I yield back.
Always a delight to hear about tax incentives. With that, we're going to hear from Mr. Dr. Foster for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chair Stevens, Ranking Member Lucas, and the witnesses for joining us here today. Developing energy storage technology will be critical as greener but more intermittent sources like wind and solar become a larger part of our generation mix. Because of this, last Congress, I introduced the Better Energy Storage, or BEST Act, along with my colleague from this committee, Representative Sean Casten. The legislation directs the Secretary of Energy to establish aggressive goals to develop improved capacity targeting lower costs for grid-scale storage. And I'm proud that the BEST Act became law in 2020. It was a step in the right direction, but we need to do more and use all of the tools that we have available to us, scientifically and legislatively. The Department of Energy recently announced a long-duration storage Earthshot initiatives to accelerate breakthroughs in this area. This is a great first step, but the primary focus of DOE's initiative is on storage systems that deliver on the timescale of 10 hours of energy storage. What is missing here is a focus on the energy storage that addresses the summer-winter problem, and not just the day-night problem or the weekly fluctuation problem. Mr. Harrell, how can Congress implement policies that will continue to incentivize advancements of these much more challenging long-term seasonal level storage technologies, especially since recovering the capital costs of these investments is really tough for an energy system that's only charged and discharged, once a year?
Yes, it's a great question, Congressman, and thank you for your leadership on these issues. Obviously, catalyzing new storage technologies is really essential to bringing technologies into market and decarbonizing the power sector. I think there's a huge opportunity here. So the Department of Energy has roughly $500 million to invest in new energy storage cost shares over the next 5 years, and important authorizations directing them to do that in the next very soon through the legislation that you enacted. We need to ensure there's a diversity of technologies that they invested in there. Long duration, that kind of 10-hour stuff is important, but the seasonal issues are extremely important as well. And so I'm really encouraged by the private sector investment in the storage space, and I think there's a bunch of really nascent venture companies coming forward, but we need that type of partnership to deploy the first-of-a-kind technologies. And so ensuring that there's technological diversity, and that's particularly been a problem in the storage space. We were doing some analysis on Office of Electricity spend recently, and see that storage, those offices haven't done competitive cost shares to deploy new grid scale technologies, and I think it's why legislation like yours was so important.
Yeah, but there's still, there's a difference in how you incentivize it if it is the summer-winter problem, because it's just really tough to, you have to have some understanding of what the summer-winter cost difference will be for marginal electricity. You have to understand what the cost of the alternative, which is to demand management, and just saying, okay, some industries are going to go offline and handle it that way. Just say, we'll make steel when we have extra electricity and we won't when we won't. This sort of approach. And so how is that modeled, and how is that, how do we understand whether the incentives that we're putting in place will really model the way the economy will work when everything gets built?
Yeah, it really underscores the need to modernize our systems as a whole here in the U.S. The electricity system, our grid management, making things more cohesive, so we can make those strategic decisions to balance energy demands where they're needed, whether it's due to seasonal needs from just needing more heat in the winter, things along those lines, or, dealing with, heavy manufacturing at certain portions, things along those lines. And so I think investments across grid management and partnering with, our utility sector partners and heavy industrial users to make those strategic decisions are going to be really important.
Yeah, but the toughest thing is we have to understand what the cost arbitrage possibilities are for this. Is that how much is someone really going to pay you for storing, storing energy when it's cheap and giving it back to you when it's somewhat more expensive? Anyway, so when you figure that out, let me know, because there's a need for federal action here.
Fortunately, PJM and that covers your state in the Midwest do have these kind of multifaceted markets to try to value storage and assets along those lines. We don't have those type of structures, in other parts of the country as well.
Well, thank you. My time is up, and I yield back.
Great, and with that, we will hear from Mr. Letourneau for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I appreciate it. My questions are for Mr. Harrell. Climate change is certainly a serious issue, and I think evidence shows that the United States has taken it seriously. Without sweeping social legislation or economic restructuring, our nation's greenhouse gas emissions have declined 21% since 2005. I believe this committee models how it is possible to work together in a bipartisan way to discuss legislative incentives for emissions reduction. However, I'm concerned that many of the current administration's actions are focused more on sending a message to their progressive base than actually producing reductions in global emissions. Unfortunately, this has often led to decisions that come with a huge economic and minimal emissions reductions. For example, the Wyoming Energy Authority estimated that the ban on federal land, oil, and gas leases would cost the United States $33.5 billion in GDP and $8.3 billion in state tax revenues. The cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline instantly eliminated 1,000 jobs and materials that would have been transported via pipeline and now will require higher carbon emitting forms of transportation. Instead of American energy, countries are forced to depend more heavily on volatile nations like Russia, whose natural gas exports to Europe have 41% higher life cycle emissions than ours. Rather than cutting back American energy production during a period of domestic inflation and an energy crisis in Eastern Europe, are there any cost-effective ways to deploy clean energy solutions right now?
Congressman, thank you for the question, and thank you for your leadership at this committee on important bills like the Super Act that was approved earlier last year on a bipartisan basis. It's a really important question as we move forward here. I think there's three things that would make sense for this committee to move forward on. One, continuing to double down on driving down the cost of clean energy here, making clean energy cheaper and more affordable is important to both not only meeting our energy needs, but also seizing export opportunities or filling important energy security opportunities. We saw this, as you mentioned, firsthand in Europe as their reliance on Russian gas was particularly troublesome and limited, frankly, the West's ability to respond to a Russian aggression. We need to streamline permitting here in this country so that we can deploy technologies faster. So that's in increasing clean energy generation in this country, demonstrating new technologies that we can then market to the world, and in increasing production of clean resources. So, for example, we think hydrogen is a huge opportunity given that we have a competitive advantage there, and we can produce low intensity, carbon intensity hydrogen, for example. And so I think those type of measures make a lot of sense as we look to drive down the cost of clean energy and increase our energy independence and security.
Thank you for that answer. I'm going to stick with you. The United States has some of the most affordable energy in the world. Electricity prices here are 3 times lower than in many European countries. Do you know of any country that is currently reducing emissions in a more cost-effective way than the United States? And if you do, how can we model that behavior?
I mean, as I mentioned in my testimony today, I think that the U.S.'s role is at this very issue. There is no one better at innovating and creating new, cost-effective clean energy technologies. The major global gains that we've seen over the last decade that have helped reduce the forecast that the IPCC has made, for example, on climate impacts, is the result of the build-out of solar, wind, natural gas, and battery technologies that U.S. investments played a major part in making cost effective. We need to do more of that across clean technology, across sectors of the economy. It's why I think we need to spend more time on innovation in the industrial sector, for example, because I think we can be a global producer that provides low carbon materials to the world as we look to support growth in countries and support American competitiveness and American supply chains.
Thank you for that. Nuclear power is a relatively clean form of energy when stacked up against traditional fuels like coal or natural gas. Even so, the state of New York shut down multiple reactors, citing environmental concerns. When they couldn't completely fill the energy void with other forms of renewable technology, they had to supplement their energy production with gas-fired generators, and their emissions actually rose in the long run. My own district in Kansas is home to the Wolf Creek Nuclear Generating Station, which generates enough electricity to power more than 800,000 homes. A perfect example of the efficacy of non-traditional forms of energy production. Can you expand on the importance of the current nuclear system in meeting climate goals and speak to the market potential of American investment in advanced nuclear power?
Absolutely.
And do it quickly, I'm out of time.
Existing nuclear is essential to preserve. We need to grow our share of nuclear power in this country, zero emission electricity. And so preserving the existing fleet while deploying this new wave of technologies is essential to meeting our climate goals, and is a huge opportunity abroad as well. The global nuclear demand market is over $1 trillion, and so we need to seize it.
Hey,
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Thanks for the indulgence.
No, that's great. That's great. Anything for the gentleman from Kansas. With that, we will hear now from a wonderful mathematician, the congressman from California.
Well, I thank the chair lady for that introduction, and I thank the witnesses for preparing and testifying today. My first few questions are going to go to Ms. Barrett. NOAA is doing critical work within the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research to improve our observation of aerosols and our understanding of their impact on Earth's radiation budget. Measuring aerosols in Earth's radiation budget is essential to determining emissions levels and pathways. Working Group 1 details this extensively. Ms. Barrett, can you speak to the importance of this research and what gaps still exist in our understanding?
Yes, thank you, Congressman McInerney, for your question. Good to see you. As you point out, that research is really essential. Some of the largest gaps in our understanding of the climate system have to do with aerosols. And so we're very proud to be engaging in that research and including expanding our observations into the stratosphere, which is very undersampled.
Well, thank you. What resources does NOAA need to improve our understanding of aerosols, cloud, aerosol interactions, and atmospheric chemistry?
I don't have a figure for you off the top of my head, but I can say that we very much appreciate the approximate $10 million we get a year to advance the modeling that we have in the observations that are underway. Clouds are so hard to model, and they are yet so important to getting the projections right. Yeah, we're just very grateful to have the support to make sure that we're getting ahead on this important question.
Well, the committee generously gave me an extra minute or so I'm going to take advantage of that. Are there any existing efforts to work with non-federal partners in partnerships to improve this data and fill the gaps in?
I'll have to get back to you on that. I'm sure there are. But I just don't have that at the ready. Sorry, Congressman.
Okay, thank you. On biodiversity, Working Group 2 report details how climate change poses a risk for biodiversity loss across multiple ecosystems, including forest, kelp, seagrass, coral reefs, and Arctic terrestrial systems. I just saw a pretty devastating article in the New York Times lately as well. Ms. Barrett, to your knowledge, is NOAA or any other federal agency doing any work to quantify biodiversity loss?
I will have to check with the folks in my agency and across the federal government. You know, you have pointed out that the issue of biodiversity loss and climate change together is kind of a compounding effect. And our Working Group 2 report really did spend quite a bit of time assessing the information and the way these two work together. In fact, our IPCC report had a whole section on biodiversity hotspots across the world. And I'm sure that there are folks in NOAA who are engaged in this, and I'd be happy to get back with some specific information.
Well, good. There's no quantitative way to do this that I know of, and I think it's going to be really important for holding corporations accountable for some of the stuff they do. On drought adaptation, the Working Group 2 report focuses on adaptation and vulnerabilities. One of the major impacts of climate change in my district is the drought conditions. The American West is now in the worst drought period over 1,000 years, which means that decision makers are more reliant than ever on high-quality data to inform adaptation strategies. Ms. Barrett, how has technology for addressing drought and fresh water evolved over time, and can it be improved to help communities adapt to a future with more severe water shortages?
Yeah, thanks for that question. As you're aware, you know, at NOAA, we lead the National Integrated Drought Information System, which is coordinated across federal agencies and with municipalities and localities who are in the midst of what you rightly have identified as a mega drought, unlike what we've seen for a long, long time. I believe that the technologies for soil moisture measurement and forecasting have advanced. I'd be happy to get back to you with more specific information on the ways that that is evolving.
Okay, can aerial detection be as good as in situ measurements?
No, I don't know the answer to that question. My gut is that you always need in situ measurements in order to do the ground truthing. But I'd hesitate to say that with definitive,
Well, thank
statement.
you. Didn't mean to stump you with all these hard questions. Next question.
And stretch the time.
If you want to gavel me down, go ahead.
Please
Otherwise,
proceed.
My next question then goes to Mayor Levine Cava. The IPCC report states that in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we have to hit a peak global emissions by 2025. Geez, that's kind of short. How would you incorporate findings from the ICC report in your local level decision making around mitigation and adaptation strategies?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. We have set a goal to reduce emissions by half by 2030 and fully by 2050. Now, I have pushed my team to revisit those and see how we could do better. Of course, there's only so much that I can control as the mayor of the county. We have to work with our partners, our utilities, our private sector, and one of our most successful approaches is working with private property owners to reduce emissions in buildings, which are the second largest producer of carbon. Right. And our Building Efficiency 305 has been a great success.
Thank you. I yield.
And with that, we will hear from the congressman from Ohio for several minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since the purpose of today's hearing is to establish the need for climate action, I want to spend some time focusing on a couple important realities in the critical mineral space that have significant implications for the energy transition. First, I believe it's indisputable that a low carbon future will be very mineral intensive. World Bank projects the production of graphite, lithium, and cobalt will need to significantly ramped up by more than 450% by 2050. Supply of other minerals such as nickel, 200 to 600%. To put that in perspective, the compounding annual growth rate of nickel, which is not a rare material, is anywhere from 0 to 5%. So to respond to a rapid demand, researchers at MIT suggest we need to hit 10%. So these are big changes. Second, I believe it's equally indisputable that our supply chain here in the U.S. is far too reliant on imports from Russia and China, which currently controls over 40% of nickel production, 60% of cobalt and lithium production, and 90% of global rare earth production. Final point, which maybe is in dispute, but I believe it, is that the next decade with respect to both Russia and China is likely to see more conflict, not less, than the previous decade. So all of that points towards the need to secure our supply chains, which means promoting domestic production and processing, cooperating with allies, and finding ways to diversify away from China and Russia. Mr. Harrell, two things seem straightforward to me. One, as I said, reducing supply chain reliance on China and Russia is good. And second, reducing our dependence lowers global emissions, since we know China's grid relies heavily upon upon coal. So my question is, you mentioned permitting being an important tool for accelerating domestic production of critical minerals. Can you just drill down on that specifically with respect to the minerals that are needed to help us in the energy transition?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Congressman, for the question, and thank you for your leadership on legislation like the Super Act and the BEST Act that we were discussing earlier on storage technologies. It's really important. Yeah, as you know, the U.S. is import reliant on 30 of 35 critical minerals and has zero production capacity of 14 of those. That's a huge problem. We're going to need those minerals for deploying a wide array of energy technologies, and it's nearly impossible to permit these big projects. I did a lot of work in the Nevada delegation, home to many of our hard rock minerals in this country, and I saw firsthand, project after project, how difficult it was to get through the permitting process. There's a lithium project that just got cleared about 2 months ago that I was working on almost a decade ago. And there are really no major dynamics around that project that has changed, other than it just took them forever to move forward. And we know how important lithium is in particular. I think 10 years is probably the extreme, but it's certainly taking 5, 6, 7 years. And as we look at some of these important timelines of deploying these technologies and securing American supply chains, 2030, 2040 is not far along, not that far away, especially if we're talking about 5, 6 year chunks to permit these projects.
So you said 10 years. So an IEA analysis of major mines that came online over the last decade shows that it takes a little over 16 years to develop projects from discovery to first production. On average, it takes more than 12 years to complete exploration and feasibility studies, 4 to 5 years for the construction phase. This obviously raises significant questions about the ability to ramp up production quickly to meet the growing demand. What role can this committee play specifically? Like if you were advocating for a piece of legislation, how can we speed this up so that we can actually hit targets and not be so reliant on Russia and China for what is essentially going to be our energy raw materials?
Yeah, it's an important question. I mean, I think we need to set big, bold goals in this country on permitting, and I think that's both project deployment and it's supply chain related issues. And so setting key targets, trying to set deadlines on the federal agencies, trying to make sure that we're looking at these issues, with diligence, but getting to a record of decision and moving forward. And I think that's something that we absolutely could do here. I think we need to be investing in new types of technologies that make it easier and more cost-effective to extract these minerals, to reduce the environmental impact of those minerals. And I think that's the bread and butter of this committee, right? The Science and Technology Committee and the research that we could be doing on enhancing U.S. supply chains.
Yeah, thank you. With my last 10 seconds, I guess I would just repeat the point. We're going to need a lot of critical minerals. We produce very few of them in this country. And if COVID and Ukraine have taught us anything, it's that supply chains can be weaponized, and they will be weaponized in the future if we aren't careful. So with that, I yield back.
Hear, hear for supply chains. And with that, we will hear from Congresswoman Fletcher for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Stevens. I always enjoy hearing the questions from my friend from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, and I'm glad to follow him. That was really interesting questions, many of which I had, but I have many more. And so I have missed a few things in the hearing. I hope I'm not repeating for any of our witnesses, but I want to thank you for everything I've heard from you today. I know it is so helpful to me and to the committee as we do our work. Your insights are incredibly valuable. And I want to ask a little bit about how we in the federal government can build on what we're learning here today. In my hometown of Houston, which for more than a century has been the epicenter of the U.S. energy system, and which is today the energy capital of the world, as my colleagues are so used to hearing me say, we know and understand the many challenges that we face in this moment, from meeting the growing demand for lower emission, cleaner, lower carbon energy, to responding to the effects of climate change that we are already seeing in our community. We've seen it in historic storms and rain events that have devastated our community year after year after year. And what we know for sure is that we need smart policies that address the reality and the urgency of climate change, the concerns for our environment, and the impacts of these challenges on our communities. And what we know is that we need people to come together as advocates and neighbors to be a part of the solution. I want to note that Houston has an energy transition strategy that represents a real effort to bring people together around this challenge that we're talking about today. It complements a range of other initiatives in our community, including our City of Houston's Climate Action Plan and local initiatives around hydrogen and carbon capture, really taking on serious questions about how we develop and scale the right technologies, how we create and service markets, what the energy mix looks like and the sources of energy into the future, and really investing in the right priorities and making those investments. It's a challenge that I think we are uniquely and also determined to lead from Houston. And I think there's also a really important role that we've been discussing today and that we all know for the federal government to play in this process in bringing people together from across the country and leading people around the world. And so we know the federal government has many programs to assist decision makers like us as we develop and enact plans between NOAA and all of its work and the other programs that fall, whether under the Geological Survey, Department of Agriculture, Department of Defense, other agencies. There are a lot of things that the federal government is and can do. And what I'd like to ask all of you is sort of one general question with the opportunity to add to it in written testimony, because we've got about 2 minutes left. So maybe 30 seconds for our witnesses about which federal climate programs or practices you think are working and which ones you think are not working well, federal capabilities that should or could be altered or ramp up to expedite climate action given the urgency of the moment. So with that, maybe I'll start with Ms. Barrett and then go to each of you.
Thank you for that question, and I'll just try to answer very quickly. I think there are a number of federal programs that are working quite well across the nation and specifically at the local level. Within NOAA, we have our Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Program that works quite well with the hubs in other agencies. And there's just a tremendous amount of on-the-ground work that needs to be done, that needs to be linked to the extensive resources we have in the federal government that we need to get into the hands of decision makers.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And I would say for everyone, if you have specific suggestions, that would be great to get in the written testimony as well. I'll go next to Ms. David-Chavez.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I'll just bring to Congress the attention of the USGS Climate Adaptation Science Centers, the regional science centers, as effective hubs and resources, and appreciate the recent requests for proposals that are considering the end users that need that data, bringing in community partners to lead in the research and to inform the design and what questions we're asking, what data we're gathering.
Great, thanks so much. And Mayor Cava?
Thank you. I want to underscore that NOAA has been incredibly valuable to us and is locally present in a number of ways. And the Army Corps, because we have a serious need for infrastructure support and we want them to be more flexible in how they use those dollars. And we've been working with them to try to make that so. Also, flexible funding, like what happened with COVID, was extremely valuable to us at the local level. But we do think that there should be guardrails about guidance for communities and how they interpret building resiliently and the adaptation and mitigation strategies, but more flexible, local, not necessarily going through the states. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And Chairwoman Stevens, I see I've gone over my time. I haven't gotten to Mr. Harrell. Maybe Mr. Harrell, if you could submit that for the record, I would be very interested in your response as well. And I thank all of you so much for your time today. And Madam Chair, I yield back.
Okay. The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Jimenez for 5 minutes, please. If we don't have Barrett. Okay, we evidently don't have Mr. Jimenez, so we'll go to Representative Barrett, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank our witnesses for being here today. You know, one of the things that I think we need to talk about in the committee has a history of working with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, especially when it comes to advanced reactor licensing. And at that point, should the NRC, or at what point really, should the NRC be involved in the research and development process, like the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, or one of the test reactor facilities? And then if you respond to that, just how critical is their flexibility to be the ultimate commercialization of advanced reactors and clean energy? Mr. Harrell?
Hey, Congressman, thank you for the question, and thank you for your strong leadership on innovation here at this committee. It's a great question, and the answer is the NRC needs to be working now with all of these innovators. So we know firsthand there's an array of startup nuclear technologies in this country that are racing towards commercialization. The NRC is likely going to get at least 6 applications over the next 36 months for projects that want to deploy over the next 6 or 7 years. They need to be working proactively now and pre-application process, getting ready, partnering with the Department of Energy so they've got a good grasp of the technological things. It's going to be a challenge because it's going to be the first time that they are licensing non-light water designs in many cases. And in the case of small modular reactors, like the first time that they're looking at the true risk of what is a significantly smaller reactor that doesn't have need big security zones, for example. So we need to modernize the NRC's regulations to accommodate the true risk profile of these designs, which is significantly less, though our existing fleet is very, very safe, and ultimately be a nimble regulator so we can seize the international market. I mean, we're seeing firsthand, I've heard from a variety of these U.S. developers. They're hearing from Europeans now who desperately want these designs as they're looking to increase their energy security as they've seen the ramifications of their reliance on Russian gas, for example.
Very interesting. And as a follow-up question to that, Russia currently accounts for about 2/3 of the reactor exports worldwide. Advanced nuclear power is a potential, say, approximately $360 billion a year market opportunity. So how do we take back this share of the market and position the U.S. to lead in advanced nuclear exports? And I think that's important to us on this committee as we look to how we fund basic research in the national laboratory. So, Mr. Harrell, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. We need to demonstrate the technologies. We need to show that they are commercially viable. And so things like the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, ensuring that it's successful, is a really important piece of that. We'll build those first designs and show that we can export it and deploy them and seize that, as you mentioned, over $300 billion annual market opportunity there. And then, we need to be focused on domestic fuel supplies, for example. I think the Russian crisis has also showed us that we need to have a more secure nuclear fuel cycle, for example. And so investing in the U.S. capacity to produce high assay low enriched uranium, which is the advanced fuel needed for many of these advanced reactors, is a really important measure and an opportunity here to grow U.S. supply chains, improve our fuel security, and ultimately provide zero emission electricity both to our grid and to the globe.
So thank you for that, and you've answered several questions. So I do have a little bit of time left, and so I would open it up to any other of the witnesses that would like to make a comment about that question. If not, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Congresswoman Stansbury for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for joining our panel today. Today's hearing could not possibly be more timely or more important and on a topic that is such consequence to our communities and to our planet. Across my home state of New Mexico, our communities are experiencing a devastating drought. In fact, the worst drought in over a millennia, and unprecedented wildfires, including over a dozen wildfires across our state months before fire season. The science is clear. Climate action cannot wait, and we must take decisive action now to address both the causes of climate change and its impacts while investing in the sustainability and the resilience of our communities. This means making bold investments in diversifying our economy, addressing our carbon footprint, and investing in our infrastructure, our natural resources management, and our clean energy future, while ensuring that our communities have the tools and resources they need and a seat at the table to meet the moment. The IPCC reports that we're discussing today, as we've heard this morning, outline the consequences of inaction and the worsening impacts, especially to our water resources and especially across the western United States. In New Mexico, we have a saying that agua es vida, water is life, because it is the vital resource in the arid Southwest upon which everything else depends. Our communities are aware of the impacts of climate change because they are already experiencing them right now this year with this drought. And as a member of this committee, as well as the Natural Resources Committee, we are working very hard to try to address these issues on the ground, but have not even begun to scratch the surface because our communities do not have the basic information and tools that they need to make decisions every day to respond to this crisis as it is unfolding across our communities and make long-term plans. We need those resources to safeguard our communities. As a water resources professional, I've worked in water resources science most of my career, and a proud water nerd, as I often say. I know through my decades of work on this issue that we have to provide the best data and tools to our communities and to collaborate and use community-based processes to tackle these challenges. That's why I am proud that over the coming weeks, we will be introducing 2 bills to help address these issues in New Mexico and across the country, including a Rio Grande Basin bill, which will help to address the long-term resilience of the Rio Grande River, and a National Water Data Act in order to address critical issues around water data and information. And with that, I would love to ask our panelists a few questions specifically about the implications of these IPCC reports for our water resources. So, Ms. Barrett, as the vice chair who's been serving in this role and is here to help us understand and unpack these reports and translate that science into meaningful action on the ground, I wonder if you could please take a moment to explain the implications of these latest reports for our water supplies, particularly in the western United States, and what we can expect over the coming decades.
Yes, thank you for that question, Congresswoman. I think across our reports, there's strong evidence, both globally, but specifically in the western United States, of the increasing risk that we're seeing from the depletion of water resources with the reductions in snowpack that many communities depend on. And there's information about adapting to some of these limitations, but quite frankly, in this case, there are severe limitations to the way that we can adapt to the severe reduction in water resources we're seeing. You mentioned the wildfires that are occurring, and in our recent report, we actually evaluated the wildfires in the western U.S. and confirmed that this problem is getting worse. Higher temperatures from climate change have doubled the area burned in the West from 1984 to 2015. And the additional burned area is greater than the size of Switzerland. So this is very much connected to drought and the lack of water resources, and is a very challenging problem.
Thank you, Ms. Barrett. And I think it's important to emphasize that in New Mexico and other areas of the Southwest, we've been seeing a drying trend over the last several decades, which we now understand because of the science that has been compiled by the IPCC and others, that this is in fact the signature of climate change. So this is not something that's happening in the future. Climate change is already here. It's already on the ground. It's already impacting our communities. And as we think about our communities that have lived in these fragile landscapes for thousands and hundreds and decades of years, we have to invest in their well-being, in their resilience, and make sure that they can adapt to the change that's already here and we know will be worsening over the coming decades. So I deeply appreciate the work that went into these reports and all of the scientists and policymakers who've contributed to them. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the committee for taking the time to give space to have this conversation. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Kim for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses joining us virtually and Mr. Harrell for joining us in person today. We all agree that we need an all-of-the-above energy approach to climate change, and we need to secure America's energy independence. If anything, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown us how critical our energy independence is. So we need practical, responsible energy solutions that will help us expand and diversify domestic energy supply chains, reduce carbon emissions, and lower energy costs for my constituents. So to that end, Mr. Harrell, I have a question for you. Russian natural gas exports to Europe have 41% higher life cycle emissions than United States liquefied natural gas exports. And even worse, Russian exports to China have 47% higher life cycle emissions. So at the end of the day, greenhouse gases don't care about the borders. So can you give us a sense of why U.S. natural gas and renewable energy innovation is essential to the global effort in reducing emissions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question, ma'am, and thank you for your leadership here on this committee on some key bills that have been moving over the last year. As I mentioned earlier, energy security and climate action are not mutually exclusive. We need to drive down the cost of cheaper energy and make it more affordable and more abundant. So we have a strategic advantage in U.S. gas, for example, and you underscore some of the emissions footprint there. And then CCUS is a big piece of that puzzle as well. We need to commercialize more CCUS technologies that play a role in gas processing, in the utilization of gas, for example, in gas generation. It's the largest power source here in this country for electricity. Deploying gas CCUS is going to be critical to driving down our emissions, and so we can lead there. We are leading there. Over half of the global projects in the project pipeline are in this country, and so it's an exciting opportunity to both utilize U.S. resources in an environmentally responsible way and ultimately reduce global emissions.
Thank you. And I want to talk about China's coal fleet. That has grown fivefold over the last 20 years to reach nearly half of the global total of gigawatt power in this sector. Meanwhile, the U.S. coal uses in 2030 is now projected to be around 1/3 of what models predicted back in 2010. So it's clear that we have made changes in our energy mix and actually followed through with our emissions pledges. But are there any signs that show China is acting under a net zero commitment, and how can we hold them accountable to that commitment?
Yeah, it's why U.S. International leadership is really important on this issue, and why I think that it's paramount that we lead in technology innovation and in multilateral climate engagement as a whole. We've seen very clearly China take opposite actions, more or less, and so we've seen significant increases in their deployment of coal, for example. Another 176 gigawatts of coal is going to be under construction, and China is driving a lot of that. It's why we need to innovate on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. They have a market for that because it's the low-cost option in many developing countries, right? And so if we can innovate and drive down the cost of cheaper, cleaner options, then we don't have this false option, right, of meeting our electricity needs or or taking more expensive clean energy, for example. So drive down the cost of clean energy options. And there's just a practical reality. We're deploying gigawatts of coal, or not we, but the globe is deploying gigawatts of coal technology. We need coal CCUS to practically remove those point source emissions to meet any of these mid-century goals that I agree, I think are extremely important.
Sure, thank you. One more. California, where I represent, has seen a variety of exciting carbon capture announcements over the past year, including California Resources Corporation's Carbon TerraVault project. This TerraVault will inject CO2 captured from industrial sources into depleted underground of gas reservoirs for permanent sequestration. But what role has policy played in some of recent project announcements across the country, and what do you think is needed going forward?
It's a great question, and it's a huge opportunity. It's an exciting project in your state, and California has some immense industrial CCUS opportunities. So two big things that I think are playing a role in big project influx. The 45Q tax credit, biggest financial incentive in the world to drive CCUS deployment. It's a big part of why we're deploying technologies like this. We should enhance that incentive and continue to move forward. Two, the good work at this committee on demonstrating CCUS technologies. We're going to have a massive CCUS demonstration program implemented by the DOE over the next couple years, and this committee should exercise strong oversight over that to ensure it's successful. And then three, you point out that they're going to store the CO2 permanent underground. Something we have to fix is the Class 6 permitting regime, which is EPA's rules to store CO2. It takes roughly 6 years to permit that now. We've got to shorten that to increase CO2 storage capacity for both CCUS and carbon removal.
Thank you very much for your thoughtful responses. And with that, I think my time is up. We went overboard. I yield back.
Gentle lady yields back. The chair now recognizes Representative Perlmutter, please, for 5 minutes.
Sorry, I thought Mr. Sherman was going before me, so thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple questions. First, next week, we are having a science trip out to Colorado to the national laboratories that we are very honored to have there, and also deal with a lot of climate change, because recently we had that terrible fire that wiped out 1,000 homes in no time flat because of how dry we've had it. So I have a couple questions for all of you. The first one would be, and I guess I'm more of an optimist, and I share some of the optimism that you all have that Mr. Obernolte didn't have about what role can our national labs play in dealing with climate change, dealing with energy efficiency and renewable energy. And, I'm saying that as the congressman that has the National Renewable Energy Lab in his district. So, Ms. Barrett, let me start with you.
Sure. Thanks for that question. And I'll just note that, in our NOAA family, a number of folks lost their homes in that fire. So that hits deep for us. And I'm happy to know that you may be out there visiting our folks. I know you've been to our Boulder labs in the past. I think that the national laboratories play an essential role in building the core knowledge base from which we can innovate and work with the private sector and localities to implement really innovative solutions. I know with regard to NREL, our laboratories in Boulder have work to provide some wind mapping and other things. We do a significant amount of greenhouse gas monitoring as well in our Boulder labs. So I think that in some cases, our observations are unmatched across the globe. We have the longest observational records for some really key climate indicators. So I just can't say enough about the importance of these laboratories to incentivizing action.
Okay, Mr. Harrell.
Absolutely, Congressman. Thank you for your leadership on these issues. The labs are going to play a huge part. As I mentioned in my testimony, I think the most significant role the United States can play in tackling global emissions reductions is on innovation. And our world-class national labs, our entrepreneurs and scientific institutions here serve as kind of an innovation engine that we know can yield big cost declines on cheaper energy and making it more abundant. And I think we should double down on that agenda and utilize those unique assets that we have here to provide clean energy to the world.
Well, we've got examples with wind and with solar where we've seen the cost of those two types of power come down dramatically over the course of the last 10 years, led a lot by the national labs. Ms. David-Chavez, do you have any thoughts on this?
I do. I think, we need integrated strategies, and I've heard some really good ones today. And in terms of thinking also about creating a workforce to address the climate actions that we need, I do appreciate the opportunities for these early career scholars and youth through internships at some of the national laboratories, and some of the movement around those internships in terms of supporting mentorship and support for local and Indigenous community members that have often been excluded from the STEM workforce. For the first time, we're really seeing these type of internships, funded opportunities. And personally, I would love to see members of the community monitoring our natural resources and collecting data with the level of accountability they have, knowing their family members will depend on those water sources, will depend on those soil. I really appreciate the quality of the scientific data that they would then produce as they enter the workforce.
Thank you. Mayor, I have a different question for you. So we mentioned, these communities are just within a mile or two of my house. We were sort of on pre-evacuation of this fire, and obviously we've had this terrible drought. How do you see local communities kind of working in collaboration with our national labs to prepare themselves for what we see coming?
Yes, thank you. Well, we are working with a couple of labs. We work with the Renewable Lab in Boulder that helped us with our solar placement when we moved aggressively, I did, to put more solar installation on our facilities. And the National Academy of Science is also helping us, so at the national level. Locally, we have a very important couple of research centers at Florida International University and University of Miami. We have standing contracts with them to advise us on our work. And as far as working with the communities, that's really the secret to success, is to be prepared and readily deployed in an emergency, to pre-register those who are most vulnerable and to work to engage throughout.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. I just want to invite you and Mr. Sherman and everybody else, any other members who remain on this Zoom, to come out to our science trip to Colorado next week, where we are going to go to the National Renewable Energy Lab, where we are going to go to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency to visit their laboratory. So I'll yield back.
Well, the gentleman yields back, and we appreciate his love for Colorado. Mr. Weber, Representative Weber. Not hearing from him. Let's go to Representative Jimenez. And not hearing from him, I know we have Mr. Sherman on our screen. So Representative Sherman, you're recognized for 5 minutes, please.
I think Mr. Sherman turned off his sound, because I invited him to come to Colorado and he never even gave me a thumbs up.
Representative Sherman.
Somebody want to text him? Oh, now he's getting on the phone. Mr. Tonko, why don't I take his time?
No, what I'll do is now recognize myself for 5 minutes, and let me thank Chairman Stevens and Ranking Member Lucas for hosting this very important discussion. The hearing is very essential. Let's begin with Dr. David-Chavez. Can you describe how federal and state researchers and governments are currently engaging with local and Indigenous communities, please?
Yeah, there's some really good examples since we've been talking about my current home state in Colorado. I do work at a land grant institution, and I really appreciate the way our extension programs here across land grant institutions work with community members. And they're really re-envisioning what our responsibilities are as land grant institutions in light of the legacies of colonization as well, and how we've inherited this land. Really recognizing opportunities now to engage Indigenous communities and build tribal partnerships as well. But we're definitely in many states in the early stages of this process. There are some other really great examples though. I think if we look at the Tribal Nations Summit report, there's some good examples of federal tribal partnerships with the National Climate Assessment. We're now engaging Indigenous authorship and tribal leaders in most of the sector chapters. And yeah, those are just a few examples
Thank you.
that I can point out.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Barrett, can you describe some of the major takeaways from the IPCC report related to the environmental justice issue and the impacts of climate change on our underserved communities, please?
Yes, thank you for your question. And let me say that I spend a portion of my year in your district at Saratoga Lake and at the local Performing Arts Center. So I'm very, very familiar with your region.
Thank you.
So it's really well known that the impacts, vulnerability, and response options to climate change are not equally distributed across the world. And so in our Working Group 2 report, we assessed, say, the global data on mortality due to floods and droughts and storms over the last decade, and found that deaths are 15 times higher per event in the global hotspots of kind of high human vulnerability compared to regions and countries with very low vulnerability. And the difference really cannot be explained by hazard frequency or intensity alone. The communities that are often unequally impacted by and vulnerable to natural hazards that are worsened by climate change. And this inequity is created or exacerbated by non-inclusive processes and has real consequences for the efficacy of future action. This cycle, the IPCC drew new definitive connections between justice and effective adaptation. And in assessing potential adaptation actions, for example, the authors of the report used 3 criteria that included justice as one. So does it work? Can we do it? And are we being fair and careful not to further disadvantaged, poor, and vulnerable and underrepresented populations? And I think it's really essential that we include that information in our assessments.
Thank you. And Mayor Levine Cava, Miami-Dade County serves an incredibly diverse community. How can we increase accessibility to climate adaptation grants and programs for our underserved communities? And what strategies have worked in your community?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, we do have a unique problem here we call climate gentrification, because as the seas rise, the poorer communities have actually been on higher land. And now there's huge speculation and those lands are being purchased. And of course, it adds to the regular gentrification. So it's quite a challenge for us. We have quite a number of community groups, and we partner with them on community-based education, awareness, and advocacy. So I think that's critically important. We bring the message into the neighborhoods and we make it things that really relate to people that they can see. Again, where they're being left behind, or the risks for affordability and pollution factors. So it is truly a partnership, and I think we have a number of model organizations. One of them I founded called Catalyst Miami that does very robust, resilient education and engagement. So I would recommend that we work in partnership. Also, they're creating what they call resilience hubs that are more neighborhood-based, not only through our agencies, our public sector, so that they have more control and access to resources. And we want to work with them to create that kind of door-to-door neighborhood-based outreach and engagement.
Thank you very much. And with that, my time has expired, so we'll call upon Representative Sherman, who I believe is available now for 5 minutes of questioning, please.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding these hearings. I found them interesting, and I'm going to shock especially Mr. Perlmutter, who serves with me on financial services, and yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and With that, before we bring the hearing to a close, I want to thank our witnesses, each and every one, for testifying before the committee today. They provided great information, and the record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for any additional questions the committee may ask of the witnesses. With that, the witnesses are excused, and the hearing is now adjourned.